In a world where voices breathe life into pages, welcome to Sparrow's Realm. The story begins.
Chapter 1. The cries came first. A baby's, sharp and wet, slicing through the heavy silence. Then her own breath, ragged, desperate, alive. Liang Shuyin blinked up at the crimson canopy above. Gold-threaded cranes glided through embroidered clouds. Her body ached from within, the weight between her legs raw and familiar. A copper tang filled her nose, blood, sandalwood, the faint smoke of burnt mugwort. She knew this place. The birthing chamber of the Marquis manor. Her pulse stumbled. She remembered this moment too vividly, the pain, the dizziness, the faces around her blurring into watercolor. She remembered dying here, her hands cold, her son crying himself hoarse while poison turned her veins to ice. But now, her chest rose and fell. Her heart beat. She was alive. "Madam! Madam, you've done it," cried the maid, Alwen, rushing in with tears streaking her cheeks. "A healthy boy, madam. Heaven bless the young master." Behind her came the old madam, that smile, stretched too tight, too polished. "A son," she announced to no one in particular. "At last. Our family has a proper heir." Her words rang like triumph, not joy. Then the woman's eyes shifted toward the bedside table, where a small porcelain bowl steamed. "Drink this tonic, daughter-in-law. It will help you recover. Strength is a mother's greatest virtue." Last time, Shuyin had been too weak to question. She'd obeyed. The taste had been oddly sweet. Hours later, she'd been burning with fever, her milk had curdled, and by dawn she couldn't feel her hands. This time, she looked at that bowl and felt the hair at her nape rise. Her fingers trembled once, then steadied. "Thank you, mother," she said, voice hoarse but even. She lifted the porcelain cup, letting the rising steam curl under her nose. Beneath the syrupy ginseng scent, something rancid slithered through bitter almond, metallic decay. She recognized it now. Shuyin smiled faintly and turned her head toward the peony pot beside her bed. "Forgive me, mother," she murmured, "but the smell turns my stomach." She tilted the bowl. The liquid poured in a soft stream over the soil. The petals wilted almost instantly, black veins spidering across their pink faces. For a breath, no one moved. Then she set the empty bowl down and looked up, expression perfectly serene. "I'm afraid I've no appetite just now." The old madam's smile stiffened. Her gaze flicked to the flowers, then back to Shuyin. For a heartbeat, something cold flickered in her eyes, then it was gone, replaced by that same honeyed tone. "Delicate constitution, indeed. You must rest. We'll speak later." Her embroidered slippers whispered against the floor as she swept out, Alwyn scurrying after her. Silence filled the room once more, broken only by the soft whimpers of the newborn. Shuyin turned her attention to him. He was tiny, impossibly so, swaddled in blue silk, his face flushed and wrinkled, mouth opening in a small, hungry cry. The sight hit her like a wave. Her throat tightened. "Not again," she whispered, pressing her lips to his damp forehead. "Never again." She pulled him closer, breathing in that faint scent of milk and life. Her mind buzzed, half panic, half disbelief. She was here, for years in the past. Her body ached, her heart pounded, but the fog of death had lifted. Fate had given her back this night, the very night her tragedy began. This time, she wouldn't be the fool who smiled through deceit. She remembered everything too clearly, how her husband, Rong Zian, had stood at the door, face cool, offering the obligatory congratulations before leaving to attend court matters. How she'd waited days for him to return, not realizing he was spending those nights at the princess's residence. Her stomach turned. The betrayal had come slowly back, then disguised as indifference, smoothed over with polite distance. She'd endured it all, the coldness, the dismissive glances, the constant humiliation under his mother's roof. She'd managed the accounts, soothed servants, swallowed gossip, all to keep her position. For what? For a man who'd let her die without blinking. A dull laugh escaped her, thin and breathless. "Mistress?" Alwen's voice returned timidly at the door. "Should I fetch the wet nurse?" Shuyin wiped at her eyes, forcing calm. "Yes. And bring me a basin of warm water. I'll wash him myself." The maid blinked. "You?" "But your body," I said. "I'll wash him," Shuyin repeated, tone mild but unyielding. Alwen bobbed her head and hurried off. When the door shut again, Shuyin looked down at her son Rong Lin, if fate hadn't changed his name yet. in her past life, he hadn't lived long. He'd died before his first year, poisoned like her. Not this time. Her fingers brushed the faint pulse at his neck. You'll live, she whispered. I don't care if I have to burn this entire house to keep you safe. The basin arrived. She stripped off her sweat-soaked robe and carefully sponged the baby's face, her movements gentle but precise. With each motion, her mind sharpened. The physician. She'd have to check the physician he'd been bribed last time. And the kitchen. And the servants. The poison wouldn't come just once, they'd test her patience. But she wasn't the same woman anymore. Madam, Alwyn murmured, watching nervously. You're different today. Shuyin glanced at her, lips curving slightly. Maybe I've learned something about being alive. When the baby finally slept, Shuyin leaned back, exhaustion clawing at her limbs. She let her eyes drift over the room, the rich silks, the ornate cradle, the red candles burning low. Everything looked so grand, so secure. But beneath the beauty, she could almost hear the hissing of snakes. Her mother's old warning echoed in her mind, in rich houses, the smiles have teeth. How true that had been. Outside, night deepened. Servants whispered in the corridors, laughter echoed faintly from the distant banquet hall where the men celebrated the birth of an heir. No one thought to ask how the mother fared. Shuyin's fingers tightened around the edge of the quilt. She would have to be clever. Quiet. Careful. A wrong step could trap her again in their web. But she had one advantage now: she already knew where all the traps lay. Her husband's mistress. The poison tea. The accounts forged by his cousin. Even the loyal maid who'd betrayed her for a handful of gold. Every betrayal, she remembered by heart. And this time, she would play along until the board was hers. The baby stirred. She bent down, humming softly. Sleep, little one. Mom is here. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. When the candles finally guttered out, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, her hand over her son's tiny chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. In the darkness, her own heartbeat answered. Cold. Clear. Alive. And somewhere deep inside her, the woman who had died in silence began to breathe again, not as the obedient Marchioness, but as someone far more dangerous. Someone reborn. Chapter 2. The rooster crowed long before dawn, its voice sharp against the quiet courtyard. Servants stirred in the shadows, rubbing their arms against the autumn chill. In the women's quarters, the lanterns had been trimmed, the fire stoked, the tea tray arranged. But the mistress of the house did not rise. Should we wake madam? Whispered Mayun, the youngest maid, glancing toward the closed inner doors. Alwyn frowned, uncertain. She always rises before the Marquis. If she's still asleep, it must be because a soft humming interrupted her. Both maids froze. Through the crack of the door came a sound they had never heard from their mistress, a tune, low and gentle, followed by a faint, bubbling giggle. Inside, Liang Shuyin sat cross-legged on the bed, her hair loose over her shoulders, her son nestled in her arms. The morning light washed her face pale gold. She dipped a small spoon into a bowl of rice porridge and held it to her baby's lips. Come now, little prince, she teased softly. You're not going to scowl at your first breakfast, are you? Rong Lin kicked his tiny legs and gurgled in protest. The spoon missed, a dribble of porridge landing on his cheek. Shuyin laughed, not the polite tinkle she used in the main hall, but something warmer, freer. Alwyn blinked at the sight. Madam, it's almost time to prepare the Marquis' tea. He'll be waiting. He may eat without me, Shuyin said, not even looking up. My son's company is far sweeter. Alwyn's mouth fell open. But close the door, Shuyin murmured. You'll let the draft in. The maid obeyed before she realized it, bowing herself out as if in a daze. By the time she reached the corridor, word had already begun to spread. The Marchioness didn't rise for the Marquis. She refused to serve him breakfast. She's changed. Within an hour, the rumor had swept through every corner of the Marquis manor, from the scullery to the stables. By the time Rong Xian entered the dining hall, his every step left a trail of whispers. He was a man accustomed to order to servants standing in perfect rows, to his wife greeting him with tea, head bowed, voice soft as morning fog. This morning, there was no wife, no greeting, no tea. He sat down, the faintest furrow in his brow. The servants hovered uncertainly. No one dared move. Finally, Steward who stepped forward, bowing low. My lord, shall I call for madam? Xian lifted one brow. Why? Did she forget where the hall is? The steward immediately dropped his gaze. Of course not, my lord. Rong Xian was not a man of many expressions. His beauty was the kind that felt carved all symmetry and sharpness, never warmth. He unfolded his napkin with deliberate calm, but his knuckles were pale against the white fabric. He began eating in silence. Halfway through his meal, the doors opened. Liang Shuyin entered slowly, her steps unhurried. The light blue of her morning robe caught the sun, pale and calm as river mist. Her hair was pinned loosely, one strand falling against her cheek. She looked rested, too rested. Good morning, she said lightly, as though nothing were amiss. Xian set down his chopsticks. You seem well. I am. She poured herself a cup of tea, the motion smooth, self-contained. She didn't ask if he wanted any, didn't glance at his cup. Steam curled between them like a living thing. Xian studied her. Something was different. Perhaps it was the faint color on her lips, or the way she held her gaze level, unwavering. The Liang Shuyin he knew never met his eyes for long. She always deferred, always folded in on herself, as though waiting to be dismissed. But today, when their eyes met, she didn't flinch. Her tone was polite, her smile was pleasant, but beneath it all there was stillness. Like the surface of a frozen lake. Mother's tonics are working wonders, she said, taking a slow sip. He paused mid-bite. Tonics. His gaze flicked toward the faint line of wilted peonies visible through the open doorway. The petals were blackened, curling in on themselves. The realization came and went too quickly for anyone to see, but his hand tightened on the chopsticks. Shuyin seemed to notice. Her smile didn't waver. You look thoughtful, my lord. Is something troubling you? Nothing at all. His voice was low, almost too calm. It seems you've recovered faster than expected. I suppose I had reason to. Reason? Her eyes softened, a hint of mockery flickering there. A child changes everything, doesn't it? He said nothing. After a pause, she set down her cup and rose. I'll take Rong Lin to the garden. The sunlight will do him good. He inclined his head, expression unreadable. As you wish. She walked past him, her scent faint osmanthus brushing the air. When the doors closed behind her, silence filled the room again. Xian looked down at his meal, untouched now. He'd forgotten the taste of his breakfast. In the garden, Shuyin sat beneath a maple tree, her son bundled in a light quilt. The morning breeze carried the distant sound of drums from the city streets. Your father's confused, she told the baby conversationally. He'll think I've gone mad. Rong Lin burbled something unintelligible, one chubby fist flailing toward the sunlight. Shuyin smiled, adjusting his blanket. That's all right. Let him think it. She leaned back, watching the red leaves drift across the pond. For the first time since her return, she felt almost light. The fear that had gripped her since the moment she woke was loosening its hold. Small rebellions, that was how it would begin. No open defiance. No foolish confrontation. Just little shifts. Little cracks in the perfect image of the obedient wife. She remembered how the household used to run, every move she made reported to the old madam, every side dissected by gossiping maids. To survive, she'd have to make those same people uncertain. Uncertainty was power. She would smile, she would nod, she would speak gently, and behind every word, she would twist the knife. A servant approached, bowing low. Madam, the old madam asks if you'll join her for morning prayers. Shuyin turned, the sunlight glinting in her eyes. Tell her I'm still weak from childbirth. My prayers can wait. The maid hesitated. She may be displeased, madam. I'm counting on it. When the maid scurried off, Shuyin leaned over and kissed her son's forehead. Little one, she murmured, your mother's been asleep too long. It's time we both woke up. In the far distance, the chimes of the manor bell rang for morning assembly. Inside, her husband's voice was already giving calm instructions to the steward. But beneath that calm, something had shifted, a hairline crack in their perfect household harmony. And as the wind swept through the garden, scattering red leaves like whispers, Liang Shuyin smiled to herself. It began with breakfast. But by the time she was done, even the walls of this house would learn to bow. Chapter 3. By the week's end, the women of the capital had turned her refusal to pour her husband's tea into a tragedy worthy of poetry. Poor Marchioness Liang, sighed Madame Du at the ladies' pavilion, fanning herself dramatically. They say she no longer rises to greet her husband. Childbirth must have softened her wits. Madame Lu, never one to waste an opportunity for embellishment, leaned in eagerly. Softened? My dear, she sings lullabies at the breakfast table. Alone. Can you imagine? A sad thing, really. Oh, pitiful, another lady murmured, though her eyes glimmered with delight. So young, and already fading. Perhaps the shock of motherhood was too much. The air smelled of lotus tea and sugared almonds. The laughter that followed was delicate as glass brittle, practiced, meant to slice rather than soothe. At the edge of the gathering, Liang Shuyin sat quietly, her expression one of serene disinterest. She lifted her cup of chrysanthemum tea, the petals floating like small suns against pale porcelain. Her fan rested against her wrist, half open, half shielding a smile that didn't quite belong to the woman they thought they knew. She'd come precisely for this. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves. The nobility of Luoyang lived on Whisper's reputation, after all, was currency. In her past life, she'd spent years trying to preserve hers, patching up every rumor, pleasing everyone until she pleased no one at all. Now, she understood the truth. The only thing stronger than scandal was control of the scandal. Marchioness Liang, cooed Madame Du, her pearls swaying as she leaned forward. You've been quiet lately. We were just speaking of you. You poor thing, how are you managing? Shuyin lowered her fan just enough to meet the woman's gaze. Oh, splendidly, she said. My son is healthy, and the house quite peaceful. Peaceful? Madame Lu gave a brittle laugh. That's not what we've heard. Rumors say you don't attend to your husband at all. The Marquis must feel quite neglected. Gasps fluttered around the circle like startled birds. Shuyin tilted her head, pretending to consider. Then, with a small, thoughtful smile, oh, I wouldn't dream of depriving him of solitude. He seems to enjoy it so. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a few uncertain laughs, thin, awkward. Madame Du's fan stilled midwave. My, she murmured. You've developed a sharp tongue, Marchioness. Childbirth changes many things, Shuyin replied, voice light. Even patience. The remark lingered in the air like perfume pleasant, but edged with something dangerous. Across the table, someone coughed. Another woman hastily changed the subject to embroidery patterns. But it was too late, the tone of the gathering had shifted. The laughter came more carefully now, the glances sharper, the smiles tighter. Shuyin sipped her tea and watched. She saw everything: the way Madame Lu's painted lips twitched when the conversation didn't follow her lead, the way Madame Du's maid kept refilling her cup without being asked, an unspoken apology for overstepping. All of it fed Shuyin's quiet amusement. For years, these same women had fed on her silence, twisting every gesture into gossip. They'd watched her bend, and mistake it for weakness. This time, she'd make bending look like strategy. After the tea party ended, the host steward bowed her out of the hall. The corridor beyond was cool and shaded, lined with carved screens and the faint scent of sandalwood. Her maid, Alwen, hurried after her, glancing around nervously. Madam, those women, they were cruel. You shouldn't have to sit through such nonsense. Shuyin smiled faintly, her gaze on the garden beyond the latticed window. Cruel? No. Predictable. There's a difference. Alwen blinked. But they think you've gone mad. Let them. She adjusted her cloak, the silk whispering against her sleeve. The mad are hard to predict. Alwen frowned, still uneasy. Won't the Marquis hear of it? Shuyin's lips curved. Undoubtedly. She stepped outside, the sunlight bright on the cobblestones. The city of Luoyang sprawled below, rooftops glinting, autumn leaves burning gold in the distance. Somewhere out there, gossip was already racing ahead of her, twisting, multiplying, slipping through every courtyard like smoke. She'd once tried to silence such talk. Now, she would feed it. Carefully. Selectively. Because gossip could kill faster than poison if aimed correctly. By the time she returned to the Marquis manor, the household had already shifted. Servants glanced at her from behind lowered lashes. A few giggled when they thought she couldn't hear. In the main hall, her mother-in-law, Madame Rong, sat with embroidery in her lap. Back so soon, she asked sweetly. We heard you attended Madame Du's tea party. How delightful. Delightful indeed, Shuyin replied, gliding forward. We discussed many fascinating things, chiefly the dangers of idle chatter. Madame Rong's needle paused. How educational. Shuyin smiled. I thought so. She turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. Ah, mother, you should check the chrysanthemums by your window. I fear they may be wilting. The old woman frowned, confusion flickering before comprehension dawned. The chrysanthemums, her favorite flowers. The same ones beside Shuyin's bed last week, now blackened from poison. By the time Madame Rong looked up, her daughter-in-law was already gone, the hem of her robe trailing serenity behind her. That evening, as the lamps were lit, Shuyin sat by her window, her son asleep in her arms. Outside, the courtyard murmured with servants exchanging the day's news. She laughed at the tea party. Mocked Madame Du, they say. The Marquis's wife has lost her mind. She smiled, stroking her son's hair. Mad, am I? She whispered to herself. Perhaps. In her past life, she had begged for acceptance, fought to prove her sanity while others wrote her story for her. This time, she would write her own. If they wanted madness, she would give them elegance so sharp it looked unhinged. The baby stirred, his small hand curling around her finger. Let them whisper, she murmured. While they're busy talking, I'll be rebuilding. The moonlight painted her face silver, her eyes bright with quiet fire. Somewhere across the manor, her husband's study door closed soft, deliberate. He was hearing the rumors too. And for the first time in years, she hoped he was listening. Chapter 4. The tea house behind Luyang's West Market was small, plain, and easily overlooked, which made it perfect. From the outside, it looked like any other street shop, faded signboard, crooked doorframe, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting in from the stall next door. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and oolong, and the light came in soft through paper screens patched in places with old newspapers. Liang Shuyin sat in the farthest corner, back to the wall, hands wrapped around a steaming cup. The sound of vendors shouting filtered faintly through the window, the rhythm of an ordinary day, a sound she hadn't realized she'd missed. When the door opened, a familiar voice spoke before she even looked up. I thought you were gone, madam. Uncle's was stood framed in the doorway, older and leaner than she remembered, his beard now streaked with white. The man had served her father before his fall from grace, loyal even when fortune turned sour. His eyes softened as he approached, the faintest disbelief flickering there, as though afraid she might vanish again. I was, she said quietly, motioning for him to sit. Now I've returned for unfinished business. He studied her for a long moment, his brow creased. You shouldn't have come alone. If the Marquis knew, he won't, she interrupted gently. He's too busy pretending not to hear gossip about his mad wife. That earned her a faint snort, a sound that warmed her unexpectedly. When the tea arrived, she slid a folded sheet of paper across the table. I'll need these within a week. Uncle Zwa unfolded it. His brows rose as he read, names of silk suppliers, trusted couriers, discreet merchants. A list of quiet alliances. Madam, he hesitated, lowering his voice. Are you starting over? Shuyin's lips curved slightly. Not quite. I'm starting properly this time. For a moment, the only sound was the soft clatter of cups and the creak of old floorboards. Outside, through the paper window, the marketplace buzzed, hawkers calling, children laughing, the occasional clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Shuyin's gaze lingered on the view. She had forgotten the color of the world outside the Marquis manor, the pale blues of fabric stalls, the gleam of fresh lacquered hairpins, the voices that rose and fell like birdsong. Do you still have the warehouse my father left? She asked. Uncle Zwa nodded slowly. Half of it. The rest was seized when the taxes went unpaid, but I kept a small part, enough for storage. Good. She leaned forward. Hide away a sum of silver there. Not much. Just enough to begin something quiet. He frowned. Begin what, exactly? She looked down at her cup, watching the steam curl upward. A studio, she said finally. For embroidery. He blinked. Embroidery? Madam, that's women's work, she finished for him, one brow raised. Exactly. Who would ever suspect a harmless embroidery studio? For the first time, he smiled. You haven't changed. Oh, I have, she said softly. But not enough to stop sowing my own future. Later that evening, back at the Marquis manor, Shuyin sat alone in her room while the lamps flickered low. Her son slept in a cradle beside her, his small chest rising and falling with steady pace. She ran her fingers lightly over the old lacquered box before her, one of the few possessions she'd kept from her maiden days. Inside lay her embroidery tools, needles wrapped in silk, threads of fine color, a small hoop polished smooth by years of use. The sight of them made her throat tighten. Once, these had been symbols of her devotion. She had spent countless nights bent over robes and sleeves, stitching flowers and clouds onto the Marquis' garments, telling herself love could be sewn into fabric if she just tried hard enough. Now, they would be her armor. She spread the tools out across the desk, the needle catching the lamplight like a sliver of moon. Her hand trembled slightly as she threaded it with silver silk. The first stitch she made was small, deliberate, the beginning of something fragile but alive. A memory flickered behind her eyes, her younger self, sitting by the same window, stitching for a husband who would never truly see her. She remembered his cold voice the day he'd praised another woman's embroidery, that of the eldest princess, while hers hung forgotten in the corner. Her hand tightened. This time, her work wouldn't decorate anyone's sleeves but her own designs. And this time, it would buy her freedom. The next morning, she sent her maid Awen with a sealed note, a short list of colors, patterns, and an address in the West Market. The message would reach Uncle Zwa, and through him, a small network of merchants who owed her family old debts. By afternoon, whispers began to spread not about the Marquis' eccentric wife, but about a new anonymous embroiderer whose patterns were unlike any in the city. Designs that seemed to shift when the light hit them, as though wind stirred through the silk. Her chosen name appeared on the slips of parchment wrapped around each finished piece: Mist of Liang River. Gentle. Anonymous. Impossible to trace. That night, she sat again by the window, the moon a pale smear above the rooftops. Her needle glinted as it moved, her movements precise, rhythmic. Her son stirred in his cradle, letting out a small, sleepy sigh. She smiled, setting the needle aside to smooth his blanket. "Sleep, little one," she whispered. "Mama's working on a future for both of us." Outside, the cicadas hummed, their song weaving through the quiet like invisible thread. For the first time since her rebirth, Shuyin felt calm, not the fragile calm of endurance, but the steady kind that came from purpose. She had spent one life being careful. She would spend this one being clever. And somewhere across the manor, as the hour deepened and her husband returned from court, a single thought crossed her mind with dark amusement: let him sleep easy for now. Because while the Marquis dreamed of power, his wife was quietly building an empire of her own, one stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The flower banquet was everything the capital's elite loved to show off: color, fragrance, gossip, and carefully staged admiration. Lanterns glowed like suspended suns, illuminating the silk gowns and polished shoes of nobles who had traveled from every corner of Luoyang to see and be seen. The air smelled of jasmine and roasted chestnuts, mingling with the sharp tang of ink as scholars displayed calligraphy scrolls. Liang Shuyin's pale lilac silk whispered around her ankles as she stepped through the lattice arch into the courtyard. The dress was modest, high-collared, sleeves long, hemline precise, yet it caught the candlelight in unexpected angles. Every careful fold, every subtle hint of lavender against her dark hair was intentional. She knew her mother-in-law would have chosen something brighter, heavier, more gold-threaded, and gaudier than the sun itself. Shuyin smiled faintly. Nothing like a quiet rebellion to start the evening. The ladies of the court gave her the usual measuring glances, a nod here, a whisper there. Some were curious, some judgmental, but all would have to talk tonight, whether she smiled or scowled. Shuyin glided through clusters of silk and jade, her fan partially hiding her expression, ears attuned to the murmur of voices. It was there, near a small pavilion draped in trailing wisteria, that she saw him. Su Yining. A scholar known more for wit than rank, his ink-stained fingers evidence of endless nights spent writing poems that either made people sigh or blush, sometimes both. His smile was crooked, lazy in a way that suggested he was perpetually amused by the world, and clever in a way that suggested he knew things no one else did. "Marchioness Liang," he said, bowing slightly, the gesture casual but not disrespectful. "Do you believe flowers envy poets, or the other way around?" Shuyin paused, amused despite herself. The question wasn't meant to flatter, yet it had that strange edge of intrigue, the kind that made conversation dangerous in the most delightful way. "Neither," she replied lightly, meeting his eyes. "Both fade too quickly to envy anything." He laughed, not the polite, constrained laugh of a guest at court, but genuine amusement that reached his eyes and made them twinkle. Around them, people began to notice. The chatter dimmed, just slightly, as glances shifted toward the small, unexpected scene, the widow, faintly amused, speaking freely with a man whose smile suggested he might be plotting minor rebellions. A lady behind a folding screen whispered, "I heard Su Yining is courting the widows for inspiration." "How bold." Another whispered back, "And the Marchioness Liang? She smiles at him. Such impropriety." Shuyin didn't care. She leaned slightly toward Su Yining, amused, letting her fan slip just enough to show a hint of a smile, the kind that wasn't coy, but measured. For the first time in years, conversation felt effortless. Breathing itself felt easier, as though she could finally inhale the air of life that had been denied her. "Your verses are always clever," she said, tilting her head. "But sometimes I wonder if you write for anyone but yourself." His grin widened, showing teeth just slightly crooked. "I write for the flowers when no one is watching," he said, "and for the occasional clever Marchioness." The words hung in the air. Shuyin let herself laugh, soft and musical, without thought for the scandal it might cause. In that instant, the banquet hall seemed to shrink around them, the gossip and the judgment fading to distant background noise. Across the courtyard, Rong Xian's gaze followed her. He was perfectly still, as if carved from marble, but the porcelain cup in his hand betrayed him. A hairline crack ran along the rim unnoticed by everyone but him. His lips pressed into a thin line. His pulse, though, raced. He had seen this woman smile before, of course. But never like this. Never with someone else. Never so alive. The sight should have been a warning. It should have reminded him that he had always been too late, too distant. But he remained seated, the crack widening slightly as he squeezed the cup, a silent testament to irritation and something more insidious, the first pang of jealousy he had ever allowed himself to feel. Back at the pavilion, Su Yining leaned closer, elbows resting on the carved railing. "You know," he said, voice low and teasing, "poets are good at noticing what others overlook. Such is the way a Marchioness might be thinking of far more interesting things than embroidery or gossip." Shuyin arched an eyebrow, letting the suggestion hover in the air. "Interesting things, you say?" "Yes," he murmured. "Plans, schemes, thoughts of vengeance, perhaps. Or freedom. Perhaps both." The words made her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the thrill of recognition. This man sees without judgment. Around them, the noble women stiffened, unsure whether to be scandalized or intrigued. Rumors were already taking root. In one corner, a widow whispered to a married cousin, "They laugh like equals. Surely, she's fallen for him." Shuyin smiled faintly to herself. Let them think whatever they wished. Rumor was a weapon when wielded correctly, and she had begun to sharpen it already. "Su Yining," she said finally, voice smooth, teasing. "You must be careful. Your reputation is at stake." He leaned back, arms crossed. "Only if I care what they think. And I do not." "That makes you dangerous," she replied softly. "And clever men are always dangerous to foolish women." He inclined his head in mock solemnity. "Then we shall both need to watch our steps." She allowed herself another laugh, low and genuine. It startled even her. The past life's fear of failure, of poison, of neglect had melted away just enough to leave space for mischief, play, and perhaps, for the first time, joy. By the time the banquet wound down, the whispers had grown into a steady murmur. "The Marchioness laughs with Su Yining," they said. "The scholar dares her, and she responds." Shuyin left the pavilion gracefully, her steps measured, a hint of satisfaction in the sway of her silk. The courtyard lanterns caught in her hair, making her seem almost ethereal, a figure in control of her story, daring anyone to write it for her. Behind her, Su Yining followed at a careful distance, not to intrude, but to ensure she reached the safety of her carriage. The corners of his mouth tilted knowingly. They would speak again, he was sure, because some alliances, like certain threads of silk, were impossible to sever once intertwined. And somewhere across the courtyard, Rong Xian remained seated at the marble table, the cracked porcelain cup in his hand a quiet reminder. For the first time in years, he realized he had underestimated his wife. Not her charms, not her obedience, not even her cleverness. But her freedom. And that freedom, alive, sharp, and bright, was not something he could control. By the time the lamps dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Shuyin had returned to the Marquis manor. She entered her room quietly, closing the door behind her. Rong Lin, her son, stirred in his cradle and looked up at her, tiny fists reaching. She leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "See, little one," she whispered. "Mama's world is larger than their whispers." And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine not romance, not vengeance, but something far more intoxicating, the taste of life lived fully, with no one else's consent required. Outside, the last lantern flickered and went out. Somewhere, the wind carried the scent of lilac from her dress, of ink from the scholar's hands, and of autumn leaves drifting across the courtyard. And in the quiet, Liang Shuyin smiled. Because for the first time, she was awake. Chapter 6. Rong Xian could not place exactly when the shift had begun. Perhaps it was the day she had refused to rise for him at dawn, or the first time she had laughed with her son in the garden while he watched silently from the hall. Perhaps it was all of it, added up like a slow, insidious tide. She still lived under his roof, still appeared at the dining table with her pale hands folded neatly before her, still attended to the ceremonial niceties expected of a Marchioness. Yet, somehow, her presence felt distant. Like a star whose light reached him only in faint, teasing pulses. He tried to tell himself it was imagination, a trick of long familiarity with the routines of the manor. But the signs were everywhere, impossible to ignore. The way she met his gaze without flinching. The faint curve of amusement at corners of her lips when he wasn't looking. The soft hush of her voice as she conferred with servants, measured and deliberate. It was the evening of the moon festival when the shift became impossible to deny. The banquet hall glowed with lanterns, their reflection catching in the polished marble floor. Xian held a small, white jade hairpin, carved delicately with plum blossoms and frost leaves, a gift he had procured at great cost, meant to convey admiration, recognition, and the kind of quiet affection that words could not fully express. He approached her as she sat beneath the crimson silk canopy of her chair, hands folded around her teacup. The baby had been sent to the wet nurse's quarters earlier, leaving them alone in the hall. He extended the hairpin toward her. "For you," he said, voice steady, though a faint tension lurked beneath the surface. "I thought it might please you." Shuyin looked at it, then at him. Her smile was polite, faintly amused, and almost too calm. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You should give it to someone who loves jade." The words were not cruel. They were worse and different. Xian's jaw tightened. His grip on the hairpin faltered, but only slightly, and he clenched it again. "You used to wear such things," he said. "I used to do many foolish things," she replied evenly. Her eyes didn't flicker with guilt, nor with shame. She merely regarded him with quiet composure, like a scholar noting a footnote in a text that no longer mattered. He felt a flush of irritation he could not explain. She had always been obedient, careful to please. Even when their marriage had been strained, even when gossip lingered like mist over the manor, she had been the dutiful wife. And now, she smiled at him like a stranger who knew him well but refused to care. The banquet continued, and Xian remained seated, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of his calm. He watched her tilt her head toward a servant who had come to present tea, the corners of her lips curving as the girl spoke nervously. The way her fingers lingered on the cup, the gentle nod, the soft laugh, a sound too delicate, too musical, to be purely for the servant's benefit. It was for someone else. He did not yet know who, and that realization gnawed at him more than the obvious thought of Suining, though he suspected it. There was no scandal in the scholar's smile, no impropriety in polite conversation. Yet Xian's chest constricted as he watched the ease with which she moved through the world, a world in which he seemed to be increasingly peripheral. That night, sleep refused him. He lay in the darkened hall of the west wing, the sheets too smooth beneath him, the silence too loud. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of servants tidying the courtyard, seemed amplified. And then came her laughter. It was faint at first, drifting over the walls from the next courtyard. The wet nurse's low chuckle followed, a soft accompaniment. Rong Lin, the baby, had been fussing earlier, and the sound of Shuyin coaxing him into amusement floated across the empty halls like an invisible melody. He had never noticed how much sound filled her world when he was not in it. Her world had been there all along, vibrant, sharp, luminous, but he had been absent from it. And now, as he lay in the darkness, he realized how painfully tangible her absence felt. The hairpin lay on the nightstand beside him, an object now transformed in his mind. Once a token of affection, it had become a symbol of the gulf between them. He touched it briefly, rolling it between his fingers, but the smooth jade offered no comfort. By midnight, Xian rose and wandered the hall. He paused at the open balcony, the cool autumn wind brushing against his cheek. Lanterns from the courtyard glimmered like fireflies, carrying shadows of laughter and whispered conversations. Somewhere, a servant tripped over a stray cloth, cursed softly, and the sound echoed in the empty halls. He pressed his hand to the balcony railing, staring down at the garden. The maple trees were nearly bare, the red leaves scattered like pieces of a fragmented tapestry. And there, beneath the waning moon, Shuyin's figure moved gracefully, laughing softly as she coaxed Rong Lin into crawling after her. Her gown caught the light pale lilac against the dark soil and she moved with a rhythm entirely her own. The kind of rhythm that could not be borrowed, taught, or controlled. Rong Xian felt the first genuine pangs of jealousy in years, not the petty, fleeting envy of youth, but the deep, slow awareness of his own absence in a life that continued regardless of him. He remembered the mornings she had risen for him, the careful attention she had lavished on his comfort, the silk sleeves she had embroidered with painstaking precision to honor his name. Each memory, once a source of pride, now stung. She had been faithful, dutiful, and unnoticed. Now she was alive, radiant, and distant, and he was powerless to reclaim what he had never truly held. As the night deepened, he returned to his chamber. Sleep remained elusive. He lay there, eyes open, listening to the faint, lingering sound of her laughter fading into the distance. It was then that he understood the truth: no amount of wealth, titles, or status could bring her back to the place she had once occupied. She had changed. He had changed. And the gap between them was widening with every stolen smile, every quiet rebellion, every moment in which her world did not include him. By dawn, Rong Xian's jaw ached from tension. The hairpin remained on the nightstand, an unspoken challenge. And somewhere across the manor, Liang Shuyin stirred, her son in her arms, preparing to face another day of small victories and quiet independence. For the first time, the Marquis felt the weight of his own inaction. And for the first time, he feared that she would never again meet him and that, more than anything else, it might hurt the most. Chapter 7. Madame Rong had always preferred subtle cruelty to outright confrontation. She thrived on orchestrating discomforts and watching others flounder, savoring every whispered glance and tensed gesture. Shuyin, however, had survived more than a lifetime of these little traps. She returned with patience sharpened into something far more dangerous than obedience. The scheme began with a carefully worded invitation. Lady Shen, a noblewoman rumored to be tightly aligned with Lady Yun, was due at the manor. Her tastes leaned toward extravagance and flattery, and Madame Rong had ensured that Shuyin herself would serve the tea, a humiliation designed to rattle the Marchioness. Shuyin accepted with serene politeness. She had predicted this long before a teacup had been polished. The day arrived bright, suffused with the scent of autumn chrysanthemums. Lanterns glimmered in the main hall, casting light on the polished floors. Servants moved like rehearsed shadows, and Madame Rong's lips curved in a confident smile, sure of her victory. Shuyin entered quietly, the soft rustle of her lilac gown announcing her presence. Her hair was pinned simply with jade combs, and the faint scent of orchid trailed behind her. She bowed gracefully, eyes calm and unreadable. Marchioness Liang, Lady Shen said, fluttering her fan, it is a pleasure to visit. The manner is always so refined. Refined enough for tea, I hope, Shuyin replied lightly, leading her to the set table. Every step was deliberate, measured, fully under control. The trap was subtle, a teacup perched slightly askew on the edge of a tray. Madame Rong watched, hidden satisfaction behind her poised mask. As Lady Shen lifted the cup, it slipped. Tea spilled across the table and touched her embroidered sleeve. A gasp of surprise echoed in the hall. Madame Rong's smile tightened. Victory should have been hers. Shuyin, however, reacted with effortless grace. She knelt, retrieved her handkerchief, and began dabbing at the stain. Let me assist you, she said softly, her voice carrying over the mild shock, calm and musical. Lady Shen's eyes widened, then softened. What fine stitching, she exclaimed, leaning closer. The embroidery glimmered under the sunlight, intricate and alive. It is a simple hobby of mine, Shuyin replied, careful to keep her identity secret. I practice quietly, for my own amusement. Lady Shen nodded, intrigued but none the wiser. She continued admiring the work without realizing its creator. I have never seen such delicate patterns. The colors, they seem to almost move. Shuyin's lips curved faintly. She said nothing more, allowing the admiration to linger. Every gesture, every blink, was a subtle victory. Madame Rong, observing from across the hall, stiffened. The humiliation she had planned was slipping from her grasp. Her lips twitched, betraying her effort to maintain control. Tea concluded with Lady Shen praising the work further, her voice bright with curiosity about techniques and textures. Shuyin answered calmly, giving credit only to the anonymous artisans of the city and letting her hidden persona remain untouchable. The servants, once nervous, glanced at her with small, discreet smiles. Shuyin had turned the trap into a stage and performed flawlessly. As the guest departed, Madame Rong whispered sharp and venomous, "You embarrass me deliberately." Shuyin tilted her head with a faint smile, voice smooth as honey. "Oh no, mother. I only embarrass myself beautifully." Later, in her chamber, she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She spread her hands over her embroidery tools, tracing the outlines of patterns she would soon transform into art under her alias, Mist of Liang River. All when, her maid, peeked in. "Madam, the noblewoman admired your work." "Mother Rong, she's furious." Shuyin chuckled softly. "Let her stew. The trap was meant to humiliate me, not her. This is her own fruit of poison." That night, she threaded needle through fabric, every stitch precise, confident. The rhythm of the silk under her fingers soothed her, energizing her. The wind rustled fallen leaves outside, and the distant laughter of her son echoed faintly from the wet nurse's quarters. Shuyin laughed softly, too light, unburdened, unrestrained. In her past life, these moments would have been fleeting, stolen, or poisoned. In this one, they were hers. Each subtle victory, each maneuver of wit and composure reminded her that she was no longer a pawn. She was a strategist, a woman who could bend circumstance without revealing herself. "Mist of Liang River will rise," she whispered to herself, a vow more than a statement. "No one, not mother, not a palace schemer, not even fate itself will stop her." Outside, the lantern swayed in the autumn wind. Shadows danced across the walls, silk threads shimmered under the lamplight. And for the first time, Liang Shuyin felt untouchable. Chapter 8. Rong Lin's laughter was like sunshine in the gloom of the Marquis manor. His little arms waved wildly as he rolled across the nursery floor, legs kicking with the chaotic rhythm of unrestrained joy. Liang Shuyin crouched beside him, her hands brushing over his tiny back as she made low, clucking sounds. "Cock-a-doodle-doo," she crowed, raising her hands above her head like a clumsy rooster. The baby shrieked in delighted protest, wriggling to reach her hair, and then dissolved into a fit of giggles that made her own chest ache with joy. She leaned down, brushing his fine black hair from his forehead, and whispered, "Oh, little troublemaker. You'll be the death of my patients one day, but for now, you're everything." The nursery, once a place of tension and duty, had become a sanctuary. The servants peeked in from time to time, drawn by the unfiltered sound of happiness, smiles softening their otherwise reserved faces. Even old Aunt Wen, the housekeeper who had scowled at Shuyin's smallest missteps in the past, chuckled under her breath as she arranged folded linens, trying not to draw attention to herself. "Madam, he's so lively," one maid whispered, eyes wide. "I haven't seen the little master like this before." Shuyin glanced up from where she balanced the baby on her lap, rocking him gently. "Life is livelier when it's shared," she said, voice soft but firm. "Even in small moments like these." The baby kicked his legs again, arms flailing, squealing with laughter that echoed across the polished floors. Shuyin reached for a small stuffed cat, waving it before him. "Meow," she said, in a voice far too high-pitched for comfort. Rong Lin's eyes widened. His hands reached instinctively toward the toy, but when she pulled it back teasingly, he let out another fit of shrill laughter, the sound pure and infectious. Even the maids, gathered around to witness the little spectacle, began clapping in rhythm. One of them whispered, "He loves it, madam." "Truly." Shuyin's heart swelled as she bent over him, making another animal noise, this time a low, rumbling growl like a tiny tiger. The baby rolled over, squealing in delight, his tiny fists patting her hands, as though to keep her in check. Every gesture, every laugh, felt like a small rebellion against the rigid confines of the manor, a tiny crack in the walls of her previous life's oppression. And it was in that exact moment that Rong Xian passed the nursery doorway. He had been walking toward the garden, intending to review some documents with the steward, but the laughter stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought the sound came from the corridor, a servant's chuckle, perhaps. But no. The rhythm, the warmth, the unabashed joy, all carried the unmistakable signature of his wife and child. He leaned slightly, careful not to announce his presence, and watched them. Shuyin crouched on the floor, her hands over Rong Lin's stomach, bouncing him gently. Her robe, pale lilac, had slipped slightly at the sleeve, revealing a glimpse of delicate embroidery along her wrist. Her hair, pinned simply, had strands loose around her face, framing her flushed cheeks. She laughed, a sound so free, so utterly hers, that it made his chest tighten. The baby reached for her hair again, tugging gently, and Shuyin's hands moved with practiced grace to keep him from falling. She made a small cluck noise, and he responded with squeals of delight. Every motion was a dance, effortless, unguarded, and entirely removed from the cold politeness that had defined their home for years. Xian's jaw tightened. The sound of laughter not his, not summoned for his benefit, filled the hall and seemed to claim it as their own. His hand, which had been resting on the doorway frame, tightened into a fist. He had known her to be attentive, courteous, diligent. But this was different. She had created a world here, a space entirely for them, and he had not been invited. The image of her laughing, hair loose, eyes bright, as she tickled their son, haunted him. He lingered just long enough to imprint the scene in his mind before quietly retreating, leaving the door slightly ajar. Not a word was spoken, not a gesture made to acknowledge him. The sound of laughter, warm and unrestrained, remained. Later, in his study, Xian sank into a chair, reviewing ledgers he barely read. The quill in his hand scratched across the paper, but his mind was elsewhere. The manor, once a fortress of his authority, now seemed softened, colored by laughter, brightness, and a sense of intimacy he could not control. When had the house become her home, he wondered silently? Not in the sense of walls or roofs, but the way the air had changed, the way servants moved with ease, the way every corner seemed infused with life that was hers. He had walked these halls for years, commanding respect, enforcing rules, yet they belonged now if only in feeling to her. He recalled her gentle teasing, the way she had made even small objects come alive, the embroidered handkerchiefs, the toys, the very space of the nursery. She had been obedient before, dutiful, compliant to the point of invisibility. But now, her presence radiated autonomy, a quiet, irresistible power. The memory of her laughter lingered through the study window. The echo of Rong Lin's delighted squeals remained, soft yet persistent. Xian realized with an unfamiliar pang that these sounds, these simple, unassuming joys, belonged to her and to their son in ways he could not reclaim with authority or influence. He remembered the first time she had smiled freely since the banquet, the way her eyes danced while she spoke with Su Yining. But here, with their son, the laughter was purer, brighter, untainted by court politics or scheming. It belonged to the child and to her, not him. Rong Xian rubbed his forehead, attempting to regain composure. The paper in front of him blurred. His hand gripped the quill too tightly, scratching more ink than letters. He had always believed that authority could shape a home, that respect could command affection, that order could secure loyalty. But laughter unguarded, spontaneous, radiant was not something that could be commanded. And it was in that moment, as he listened to the fading echoes from the nursery, that he realized something he had never admitted: the house had become hers long before she formally claimed it. The walls were not just physical boundaries, they were filled with the warmth she cultivated, the small joys she allowed herself and her child to inhabit, the tiny victories of independence that made her radiant and untouchable. Xian sighed, leaning back in the chair. He could control the manor, the estate, the servants, even his own public reputation. But the laughter, the warmth, the living, breathing energy of his wife and child, that was beyond him. And perhaps, he realized, it always had been. Outside, the autumn wind rustled leaves along the courtyard, carrying with it the faintest remnants of giggles, small arms waving, and Shuyin's soft, teasing voice. It was a reminder, gentle yet piercing, that life had found its rhythm here, a rhythm that did not bend to his will. In the nursery, Shuyin lifted Rong Lin into her arms, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Mama loves your laughter, little one. Keep it safe for yourself and for the world." The baby wriggled happily, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in his father's study, and Shuyin smiled to herself. These were small moments, but they were victories, subtle, luminous, and entirely hers. For the first time, Liang Shuyin felt the full measure of her power, not through scheming, not through manipulation, but through simple, undeniable life. A mother's joy, a child's laughter, and a home she had reclaimed by sheer presence. And somewhere, in the quiet study, Rong Xian understood, though not yet fully willing to admit, that the manor was no longer just his. It belonged to her, in ways he could neither seize nor erase. Chapter 9. The rented courtyard in East Luoyang was modest, a patchwork of brick and wood with sunlight spilling through a lattice of bamboo leaves. The air smelled faintly of drying dye and fresh ink, mingling with the earthy scent of autumn leaves drifting from the nearby lane. Liang Shuyin had claimed the space quietly, arranging her tools and fabrics with the precision of someone who had lived a lifetime in rigid order yet now longed for freedom. The courtyard became her sanctuary. A single table bore a neatly stacked array of silk threads in every imaginable shade, from muted gray to the rich lilac she preferred for her personal pieces. Embroidery hoops rested on cushions, and small paper sketches, pinned to the walls with tiny nails, captured the beginnings of designs that spoke more boldly than she ever had in the manner. Her latest work depicted a flock of cranes straining against their gilded cages, wings arching toward the open sky. Another showed plum blossoms forcing their way through a thin frost, delicate petals daring the world to notice them. Each stitch, each color choice, was a quiet rebellion, a whispered refusal to be subdued. Shuyin worked alone most mornings, the only sounds being the soft scrape of her needle, the low hum of a lullaby she sometimes sang to herself, and the occasional caw of a crow perched on the courtyard wall. She had learned that the world outside could not yet know her true identity, and she took care to seal her work under her pen name, Mist of Liang River. The name carried the faintest hint of poetry, delicate enough to intrigue but untraceable to the untrained eye. By the third week, word had begun to spread. A few pieces were acquired anonymously by minor nobles, small, elegant gifts, praised for their craftsmanship and the subtle power of the designs. Rumor swirled, who is the mysterious Mist of Liang River? Whose hand can create such life in silk? It was during one quiet afternoon, sunlight casting long lines across the floor, that Su Yining arrived. He stepped lightly over the courtyard threshold, hands clasping a folded piece of embroidered silk, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. So the mysterious artist is none other than the Marchioness herself, he said, voice teasing but low, careful not to startle her. Shuyin's fingers froze mid-stitch. The needle hovered in the air, poised as though ready to declare war. She nearly pricked herself. "Scholar Su," she exclaimed, eyes wide. "You weren't supposed to know." He held up the embroidery triumphantly, letting the soft light catch the silver threads woven through the lilac blossoms. Impossible to resist. The hand is unmistakable. Only someone with your precision and patience could create these. Shuyin huffed a laugh, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Keep it to yourself. If mother or the court finds out," she trailed off, pretending to frown, though the corner of her lips betrayed her amusement. "Of course," Su Yining said, bowing slightly with a mock seriousness that made her roll her eyes. "But in exchange, allow me to write poems for your designs. Words deserve silk, don't they?" She paused, eyebrow arched. "Poetry and embroidery? You want to dress my rebellion in words?" "Exactly," he said, stepping closer, careful not to invade the boundary of her table. "It deserves recognition, and silk alone cannot carry it. The world should read your message as well as see it." Shuyin shook her head, amused despite herself. He had a way of making even subversion seem like art, like a play in which both the needle and the pen danced across a stage without anyone noticing the power behind the performance. She relented with a light shrug. "Very well. But you must promise not to circulate these poems publicly. Only I may choose who sees them." "Agreed," he said, flashing a crooked smile. Mist of Liang River remains mysterious, as it should. For hours, they worked together in the quiet courtyard. Su Yining sprawled across a low bench, inkstone at his side, reciting lines, and testing rhythms against her embroidery. Shuyin corrected a stroke here, twisted a thread there, but she also listened, intrigued, letting the words shape her perspective on her own work. The afternoon waned, sunlight turning golden, dust motes drifting lazily through the beams. Shuyin paused, threading a needle carefully. "You realize," she said lightly, "that this is more dangerous than any scheme in the manor. If word gets out, I'd have the entire capital's noble ladies visiting my doorstep with curiosity and accusations alike." Su Yining leaned back on his hands, eyes glinting with mischief. "Danger makes art sweeter. Besides, you have survived more than mere gossip, haven't you?" Shuyin smiled faintly, glancing at a crane stitched in silver silk. "I suppose so. But it's not just about survival anymore. It's about creating something that belongs to me, that cannot be taken away. The manor gave me nothing but rules, this gives me life." He nodded, understanding more than she expected. "Then we will make it live. Every thread, every word, a testament to your freedom." And so they worked, side by side, in silence at times, in conversation at others, the rhythm of needle and pen forming a dialogue that was intimate yet unspoken. Shuyin began to see the value not just in her own creations but in the way the collaboration itself sharpened her confidence. Her artistry was no longer simply a private rebellion, it was a statement, subtle yet impossible to ignore. By the time Su Yining departed, the sun had dipped low, shadows stretching across the courtyard. Shuyin cleaned her tools, folding delicate silk pieces carefully. She paused at the door, thinking of the work that lay ahead, letters to trusted buyers, deliveries arranged under aliases, patterns shared with discretion. Every movement, every decision, had to maintain her independence while avoiding the eyes that watched too closely. As she held a finished piece against the fading light, she allowed herself a small smile. Plum blossoms stretched against frost, cranes poised to take flight, these were more than stitches. They were her voice, her rebellion, her freedom embodied in silk. And soon, she thought, they would be seen, appreciated, and finally respected on her terms. From somewhere along the street outside, she could hear the faint echo of children playing, of merchants laughing, of the city moving along in its own rhythm. She felt a surge of energy, a reminder that life beyond the manor awaited, bright, chaotic, and entirely hers to claim. Mist of Liang River had begun to rise. And Liang Shuyin, Marchioness and mother, was ready to see how far her threads could reach. Chapter 10. Whispers have a way of traveling faster than even the swiftest couriers. By the second week of Shuyin's secret embroidery exhibitions, rumors began to seep into the courtyards of the capital and, inevitably, into the halls of the Marquis manor. She was seen walking with that scholar Su Yining again, one court lady whispered to another at a luncheon. The words were light, casual, like a breeze, but they carried weight far heavier than 100 silver coins. Too often, another added, fanning herself delicately. They say she laughs too freely, smiles too easily. For a married woman, it is concerning. At first, Rong Zian heard the rumors with a detached smirk. Court gossip was, after all, the natural order of politics. He lifted his porcelain wine cup, swirling the ruby-red liquid, and let the comments wash over him like background noise. But then, the cup cracked. Not in his imagination. He had gripped it too tightly, his fingers pressing into the fine porcelain until the first tiny fracture appeared. A small bead of blood formed on his thumb. He looked down, startled, then glanced around the grand hall of the court, full of lords and ministers, and the faintest trace of alarm prickled at the edges of his composure. No one noticed or cared. But the ache in his chest was unmissable. That night, he found himself wandering the long corridors of the manor. The soft rustle of silk and the faint scent of jasmine led him, almost inevitably, to Shuyin's study. The door, slightly ajar, revealed her bent over a frame, needle flashing in the lamplight. Every stitch precise, every movement deliberate, and yet, somehow, alive. "You've been busy," he said quietly, stepping just inside. Shuyin's head lifted, and her almond-shaped eyes met his. There was no surprise, no shame, no desire to hide. Only calm, almost audacious composure. "Better than being bored," she replied lightly, her voice carrying a hint of amusement, as if they were discussing weather rather than the growing scandal in the capital. Xian's lips twitched, a smile that did not reach his eyes. He wanted to ask, wanted to demand, "Is there someone else?" The question burned in his chest, but pride strangled it, leaving only a dull ache and a weight in his gut. Instead, he watched. The way her hands moved across the silk, threading silver through lilac blossoms, the way her lips pursed slightly in concentration, the way her hair fell loose around her face, it all made him realize, painfully, how little attention he had truly paid to her before. Her laughter with Su Yining, her easy smiles, the subtle joy she carried, he had taken it all for granted. In his pursuit of status, politics, and control, he had ignored the simple truths of warmth and life that were always there, waiting quietly for recognition. Shuyin noticed his gaze, and instead of recoiling, she raised an eyebrow. "You've been listening to the court gossip, I presume?" she asked, a faint teasing lilt to her tone. "I am well informed," he said, with just enough severity to hide the vulnerability behind his words. She tilted her head, smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "And what do you think of it?" "I find it curious," he said carefully. Curiosity barely scratched the surface of the storm inside him. He wanted to control it, to extinguish it, but the more he watched her, the more impossible that seemed. Shuyin returned to her work, threading a new line of silver through a frostbitten plum blossom. "Curiosity is the polite way to say envy," she said lightly. "Be honest, Marquis. Does it bother you that I exist beyond your oversight?" Xian swallowed hard. He could not deny the truth. It did bother him more than he would ever admit. Not because of Shuyin, not because of court whispers, but because she had grown into herself. She had become radiant and untouchable, and he had no claim over her heart or her talents anymore. He stepped closer, drawn by the scent of her perfume, the warmth of the lamplight brushing against her face. For a moment, he considered reaching out, touching the delicate curve of her wrist, the fine embroidery she had just completed. But pride and the awareness of countless past failures held him back. Shuyin noticed his hesitation and smiled faintly. "You've grown quiet," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of observation. "I suppose even a marquis can be lost in a courtyard full of threads." He swallowed, tense, and forced a laugh that sounded hollow in the quiet room. "Perhaps," he admitted. "But tell me, are all of your threads and poems for the city's gossip to enjoy, or do you leave some for the eyes of those who truly matter?" Shuyin looked up, her needle poised midair, and regarded him carefully. "Some are for those who matter," she said, deliberately ambiguous. "But one must choose carefully who belongs to such intimacies. Not all marquises understand the language of silk and shadow." He flinched slightly, the reference felt pointed, a reminder of his failings, his neglect. He had assumed she was obedient, predictable, and safe within the walls of the manor. He had been wrong. Every stitch, every whispered rumor, every poem he had glimpsed in secret reminded him that her life had grown vibrant beyond his influence. There was a long pause. The only sound was the soft scratching of her needle, and the faint creak of the floor beneath his boots. He wanted to say something, anything to reclaim a piece of the connection he had lost, but words failed him. Pride, frustration, and an unfamiliar ache tangled inside him, leaving only the awareness of what he had taken for granted. Finally, he turned, stepping toward the doorway. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the sweep of her hair, the faint glimmer of silver threads. He inhaled sharply, the scent of her perfume clinging to his sleeve as he left, more vivid than any memory he had carried before. That night, he could not sleep. He replayed the afternoon in his mind, her laughter, the teasing tilt of her head, the gleam in her eyes when she spoke of the city gossip. Every detail burned into him, sharp and undeniable. The manor, once a place of power, now felt strange, hollow in its spaces, filled with sounds and joys he could not command. Rong Lin's soft breathing from the nursery seeped through the walls, and for a moment, Xian understood the depth of the world he had been missing. A home, a family, a life alive with laughter and quiet rebellion, all of it had grown without his permission, and he could do nothing to reclaim it except watch. He rose from the chair by the study window, brushing his sleeve absently. The crack in the wine cup from that afternoon remained, a subtle reminder that control was never complete. Shuyin's world, threaded with silver and lilac, with rebellion and laughter, was hers entirely untouchable, radiant, and terrifying in its vitality. As he left the courtyard, the whispers of scandal followed him in spirit. Court gossip could try to shame, to provoke, to mislead, but the truth was far more potent. Liang Shuyin had created a world for herself, and even he, the Marquis, had no key to its doors. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the leaves, carrying faint laughter from the distant street. Xian inhaled, tasting it like something forbidden, beautiful, and fleeting. For the first time in years, he realized how much he had taken her warmth, her presence, her life itself, for granted. And he understood, with a pang of bitter pride, that whispers were powerless against threads woven with intention, and against a Marchioness who had finally learned to live for herself. Chapter 11. Night had fallen over the Marquis manor like a velvet curtain, thick and suffocating. The corridors were silent, save for the occasional creak of a floorboard under a passing servant or the distant rustle of silk robes in the guest chambers. Within this stillness, Liang Shuyin's study glowed softly, lit by a single candle flickering on the edge of her table. Shadows danced across the walls, tracing the curves of embroidered sketches and swatches of silk pinned haphazardly in her search for inspiration. Shuyin hummed quietly to herself, threading silver through a delicate plum blossom. Her movements were precise, deliberate, almost meditative, and for a moment, she allowed herself to sink completely into the rhythm. This was her moment of control, a small sanctuary carved out of a world that had once dictated every breath she drew. She didn't hear the door open until it snapped shut behind her, the sound loud enough to make her start. She froze mid-stitch, fingers clutching the needle, and for a heartbeat, the room held its breath with her. Rong Xian stood in the doorway, half-shrouded in shadow, his dark silhouette cutting through the golden candlelight. He leaned slightly against the doorframe, posture tense yet unnervingly composed. "You've been meeting that scholar too often," he said, his voice low and measured, but there was a tremor beneath it, a barely contained edge that betrayed more than just concern. Shuyin's hand stilled, but she didn't look up. Her lips curved faintly, amusement laced with something sharper, something like challenge. "You're the first husband to care about a wife's hobbies, Marquis. I'm flattered." "This isn't a joke," he hissed, stepping fully into the room. His shadow fell over the candle, stretching long and sharp across the scattered fabrics. His jaw was tight, knuckles whitening at his sides, every inch of him taut with the effort of restraint. Shuyin finally lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting his. Calm. Steady. Unflinching. There was no fear, no subservience, only clarity, and the faintest glimmer of triumph. She set the needle aside carefully, letting the thread curl over the edge of the table. "You never noticed when I cried for you," she said softly, the words deliberate and cold in their weight. "Don't notice now that I've stopped." It was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, that made the air itself heavy. Xian froze mid-step, staring at her as though she had drawn a sword without the motion, striking with intention and precision. His chest heaved slightly, but he could not speak. Every polite, practiced argument, every carefully maintained sense of authority, all of it shattered against the calm force of her gaze. Shuyin gathered her fabrics, draping them over her arm like banners of victory reclaimed from a battlefield that had once been hers. She moved past him with the grace of someone accustomed to sliding between the cracks of a world built on expectation. The flickering candlelight caught her robe, illuminating the delicate embroidery of cranes and frost-laden plum blossoms stitched along the hem. She paused for a moment, letting the glimmering threads catch his eye, a subtle reminder that she had always been present, even when he had not seen her. When the door shut behind her, the faint click echoed in the study, leaving Xian alone with the dying candlelight and the oppressive quiet of his own thoughts. His hand, pressed absent-mindedly against the table where the candle had burned, did not recoil. He didn't feel the heat, didn't notice the small burn forming on his skin. Nothing mattered but the echo of her words, the quiet assertion of her independence, and the devastating clarity that she had grown beyond his reach. He sank into the chair she had left, gripping the arms so tightly that his nails dug crescents into the lacquered wood. She had always been patient, always careful, always silent. And now, for the first time, she had spoken, not to plead, not to beg, not to charm, but to declare. Every word was deliberate. Every pause a dagger. He had watched her, thought he understood her, but had only ever glimpsed the surface. The study was heavy with the faint smell of ink and silk, the quiet warmth of candlelight mingling with the crisp chill of the night air that seeped through the open window. Xian closed his eyes, trying to untangle the swirl of anger, disbelief, and something he could not name. It was frustration, yes, but beneath it was something quieter, something that pricked at the corners of his heart with a slow, insistent burn. He remembered the afternoons when she had sat silently beside him at the manor, obeying every command, tending to every duty, her eyes downcast, her laughter rare. He had assumed he knew her world, but he had only known the walls she was forced to inhabit. And now, here, in this small study flooded with candlelight and the remnants of her quiet defiance, he saw the truth: she had never needed him. She had merely endured him. Xian clenched his fists, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, as if the act itself could help him reclaim some measure of control. But there was none to claim. She had outgrown his authority, outmaneuvered the whispers, and woven a life that no amount of title or rank could penetrate. The candle flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows that leapt across the walls. It was as if the room itself echoed the fire she had ignited within him, a fire that burned not in anger alone, but in recognition of his own failures. He could feel it, gnawing at the edges of his pride, forcing him to reckon with a truth he had never dared confront: she was untouchable, and he had played no part in her awakening. He pressed a hand to his temple, feeling the heat of the burn on his fingers, but still not reacting. The pain was irrelevant, pale in comparison to the ache lodged deep within him. A lifetime of assumptions, of taking her presence for granted, now confronted him with the reality of absence, a presence that existed, vibrant and unapologetic, beyond his grasp. For hours, he sat there, the candle burning low until it wept molten wax over the wooden edge of the table. Every tick of the night clock seemed to echo her words, reverberating like distant thunder through the quiet of the study. "You never noticed when I cried for you. Don't notice now that I've stopped." It was more than defiance. It was declaration. She had claimed herself, her work, her joy, and even her anger. She had carved a world in which she thrived, and he could do nothing but witness it. The fire she had sparked in him, one he had never thought he would feel for her again, roared quietly, consuming every assumption he had held about marriage, loyalty, and the subtleties of love. By the time dawn's first light crept through the window, Xian had not moved. The candle guttered and died, leaving the study bathed in a pale gray light. His hand was marked with a faint, red scar, but it was meaningless. What mattered was the imprint her words had left on him, the unshakable realization that the Marchioness he had once possessed so fully was no longer his to command and perhaps never had been. Outside, the manor was waking. Servants shuffled down corridors, the nursery began to echo with the soft murmur of Rong Lin's mourning, and the city beyond its walls carried on oblivious to the quiet, fierce battle that had just unfolded in one candlelit study. Xian rose at last, moving slowly to the window. He gazed across the courtyard, the morning light touching the delicate cranes stitched along the hem of her robe, the swatches of plum blossoms she had left on the table. And he understood, fully, painfully, that the fire she had always carried was one he could neither douse nor command. And perhaps, he thought bitterly, that was exactly how it should be. Chapter 12. The Lantern Festival transformed the capital into a dreamscape. Streets were lined with paper lanterns in every imaginable shape, rabbits, dragons, blooming lotuses casting a warm, golden glow over the city. Lanterns bobbed in the night air like drifting stars, their flickering flames reflected in puddles and polished stones. The mingling scents of fried pastries, spiced tea, and incense curled through the alleys, wrapping the crowd in a heady mix of sweetness and warmth. Liang Shuyin moved through the throng with ease, her son perched snugly on her hip. Rong Lin's tiny hands gripped her sleeve, eyes wide with awe at the lanterns ascending above. He pointed at a cluster shaped like fireflies, laughing in a sound so pure it made her chest ache with affection. "Make a wish, Linner," she whispered, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Make a wish for something wonderful." Rong Lin's eyes sparkled as he looked upward. I want a crane that flies to the moon." His voice rang out, bright and earnest. Shuyin chuckled softly. "The moon is very far, little one, but perhaps a crane can take your dreams a little closer." At her side, Su Yining carried a paper rabbit lantern, carefully painted with subtle strokes of gold and crimson. He crouched slightly so that the light illuminated Rong Lin's face. "For the little Marquis," he said, smiling. "May he never grow as serious as his father." Shuyin laughed, warm and unguarded, the sound like wind rustling through the courtyard bamboo. She had not realized how easily joy could come now, how unburdened she felt from the constant tension that had once wrapped around her heart like chains. Su Yining's grin widened as he handed the lantern to Rong Lin, who giggled and tried to grasp both Shuyin's hand and the lantern stick at once. "Careful," Shuyin said, steadying the thin bamboo. "It's fragile like your little fingers." The crowd moved around them in a river of silken chatter, but Shuyin and her small family formed their own calm center, laughing and pointing at lanterns shaped like phoenixes, lotus blossoms, and tiny scholars balancing scrolls. Su Yining encouraged Rong Lin to release his lantern first, and the boy's squeal of delight rang out as the little rabbit sailed into the night sky. "See?" Su Yining said, laughing. "Even lanterns are afraid to keep such a lively spirit grounded." Shuyin smiled, eyes shining. "I hope it carries his wish well." And somewhere across the crowded street, Rong Xian saw them. At first, it was just a flicker in his peripheral vision, the Marchioness, radiant in a simple silk robe of soft lilac, her son clasping her sleeve, and the scholar walking beside them like a loyal shadow. But then he caught the sound of her laughter, rich, free, effortless, and it pierced him deeper than any sword could. He pushed through the crowd, careful to remain unnoticed, yet the closer he got, the more the scene seemed to mock him. There was Shuyin, unburdened and alive, Su Yining, polite and composed, and Rong Lin, oblivious to the currents of adult jealousy, laughing like the world was nothing but this moment. Xian stopped near a stall, the warm smell of candied fruits doing nothing to soothe the sudden tightness in his chest. He reached for a lantern to distract himself, a small golden one in the shape of a dragon, and tried to force a smile. But the bamboo stick snapped between his fingers, splintering like his composure. He cursed under his breath, hiding the fragments in his palm. The crowd moved past him, unaware of the small tragedy, but the sight of Shuyin's serene, laughing face remained firmly in his mind. Su Yining, sensing the tension without looking, turned just then, meeting Xian's gaze across the glow of floating lanterns. His expression was polite, curious, but utterly unafraid. He smiled faintly, a challenge unspoken, and gestured to Rong Lin's released lantern as it floated upward. Beautiful, isn't it? He asked softly. Xian's jaw tightened. He wanted to step forward, to reclaim some semblance of presence in her life, but the polite barrier in Su Yining's eyes made the thought impossible. He felt something unfamiliar and bitter rise within him, helplessness, tinged with jealousy, and a sudden, sharp awareness that he had no claim here, not to her laughter, not to her joy, not to the bright little life in her arms. Shuyi noticed the slight tension in the air and looked briefly over her shoulder. Her gaze met his for a fraction of a second. She smiled faintly, a smile that carried no invitation, no guilt, only the light of someone fully at ease with her own world. It infuriated Xian in a way he could not articulate. He turned away abruptly, brushing past the crowd, his pride leaving trails of splintered lantern sticks behind him. The festival roared on. Firecrackers lit the sky, dragons of colored paper undulated above the rooftops, and children squealed as they raced lanterns along the cobblestones. But Xian moved like a shadow, retreating into the quiet streets, leaving the warmth and light behind. He did not notice the fireworks' final display, the grand burst of red and gold and silver that painted the sky in celebration. That spectacle belonged to them, not to him, and he could not bear to watch. Meanwhile, Shuyin continued, unaware of the silent storm she had left in her wake. She helped Rong Lin hold his next lantern, a small crane painted with delicate strokes of white and silver. Try again, Linner, she encouraged. Steady hands this time. The boy nodded seriously, mimicking her movements, and with a gentle push, released the lantern into the air. It hovered a moment, catching the breeze, and soared upward alongside hundreds of others, tiny flames drifting toward the stars. Su Yining clapped lightly, eyes twinkling. You see? Wishes always find their way. Shuyin laughed, a sound that seemed to join the chorus of lanterns rising toward the heavens. She tilted her head, watching the firelight shimmer across her son's face. Perhaps they do, she said softly. The night stretched on, filled with light, warmth, and laughter. And somewhere in the shadowed streets, Rong Xian walked alone, aware that for the first time in years, the Marchioness's world was entirely hers, luminous, untouchable, and far brighter than he could reach. Chapter 13. Spring had arrived in Luoyang with a sharpness that belied its usual gentleness. The air smelled faintly of apricot blossoms, yet beneath the scent of flowers lay an undercurrent of tension, like the electric charge before a storm. The capital buzzed with rumors, whispers that crept into every corner of the city, from the gilded halls of the imperial court to the crowded teahouses where merchants speculated on fortunes and downfalls. Lady Yun's name surfaced constantly. Bribery. Forged decrees. Secret letters to border generals. Each accusation grew louder, wilder, until even commoners in the marketplace spoke her name with a mixture of fear and awe. And at the edge of every whisper, lurking like a shadow, was the Marquis Rong Xian. His name now sat uncomfortably close to hers in every rumor, as if mere proximity could tarnish a man's reputation overnight. Within the Marquis manor, the atmosphere thickened. Servants moved faster than usual, heads bent in hushed conversation. Footsteps echoed more loudly than necessary, and the household dogs, usually calm, barked with an anxious insistence. When a messenger arrived bearing a sealed imperial order, the tension snapped to a breaking point. Even the usually unflappable butler, old Uncle Gao, paled as he carefully presented the scroll to Xian. The Marquis broke the wax seal with deliberate calm, his fingers shaking ever so slightly beneath the veneer of control. The words inside were terse but clear. Investigations had been initiated into Lady Yun's dealings, and anyone associated with her was to be questioned, their loyalty and judgment under scrutiny. For Xian, this meant a storm had been summoned directly over his head. He turned slowly, eyes sweeping the hall. His household, though loyal, mirrored the panic in their expressions. Servants glanced at one another nervously, unsure how to proceed. For the first time in years, Xian felt the weight of uncertainty press against his shoulders, a cold reminder that even power and rank could not shield him from scandal. From her embroidery desk in the corner of the grand study, Liang Shuyin observed quietly. Her fingers moved deftly over the silk, threading delicate frost-laced plum blossoms, but her mind was fully aware of the winds shifting in the city beyond her walls. She could hear the whispers of the household, the muffled gasps, the frantic flipping of ledgers, and she felt none of the panic that had seized them. Instead, she rose calmly, walking to a small chest tucked beneath the floorboards. Silver coins, enough to start a small business, were quietly removed and stored in a series of hidden pouches. Ledgers were signed over to trusted agents, designs folded carefully and packed away into crates. She moved with purpose, efficient and unhurried, every action precise. This was foresight, not fear. She had lost everything once, and she would not allow history to repeat itself. When Xian returned that evening, exhaustion etched deep lines into his features. His robes hung limply, and the faint trace of stress lined his dark eyes. He had walked the streets of the capital, consulted his aides, and witnessed the first ripples of Lady Yun's network beginning to collapse under the weight of suspicion. He found Shuyin still at her desk, the candlelight illuminating the meticulous rows of thread and swatches before her. She had not noticed his approach, her focus remained entirely on her work. For a moment, he considered calling out, but the sight of her calm composure gave him pause. "You knew," he said flatly, his voice heavy with accusation, exhaustion, and something else he could not name. "Before it happened." Shuyin looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no triumph in her expression, only a serene clarity that cut deeper than any rebuke. "I knew Lady Yun would ruin anyone near her," she said softly, voice steady, measured. "I just didn't think you'd stand that close." For a moment, Xian looked like a man who had swallowed fire. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, searching for words that would restore some measure of control, some sense that he was still the master of the world he had built. He could not find them. I trusted my judgment," he said finally, the words weak in the face of her quiet certainty. "I thought proximity to her would not influence me." Shuyin leaned back slightly in her chair, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Influence is not always obvious, Marquis. Subtle corruption spreads quietly, like frost through a vineyard. You felt none of it at first, but the seeds had been sown long before your awareness caught up." He clenched his fists on the edge of the desk, nails pressing into polished wood. "And you prepared for it?" She nodded, gathering her embroidery tools with gentle, deliberate care. "Preparation is different from paranoia. One learns, after losing everything once, to act before disaster strikes. Consider this a courtesy to those around you, including your household." Xian's jaw tightened. He had never seen her like this. Calm, precise, almost untouchable. Her world existed entirely on her terms, and he was witnessing the truth of it for the first time. The Marchioness he had believed obedient, fragile, and entirely within his reach had grown into something formidable, something that neither scandal nor his influence could touch. "I underestimated you," he admitted finally, voice low, barely a whisper. He did not know if he was confessing to her, or to the echoing shadows of the study that had witnessed centuries of the house's quiet power. Shuyin's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You did," she said simply. "And perhaps you should be grateful. Underestimation can be instructive." Xian looked down at his hands, remembering the crack in his porcelain wine cup from the previous weeks, remembering the rising panic in his household, remembering how helpless he had felt against Lady Yun's schemes. Yet even now, he was aware that Shuyin's calmness was not just strategy, it was life lived deliberately, fully, and without reliance on anyone but herself. A small smile flickered across his lips, but it was tinged with frustration and helplessness. He realized he had been attempting to protect her, or perhaps himself, from forces that she had already anticipated and circumvented with elegance. The lesson stung. Shuyin returned to her work, and Xian, for the first time in years, remained silent in her presence. No command, no reprimand, no question could pierce the calm that she had cultivated. He understood that this was no longer about scandal or gossip, it was about control, and he had none. Outside, the night was still, the city humming faintly with the activities of the capital's denizens. Even as Lady Yun's name spread like wildfire through teahouses and corridors, Shuyin moved like a quiet shadow in her study, aware, prepared, untouchable. Xian could only watch, realizing that the world had shifted beneath his feet, and the woman at the center of it all was the one person he could neither influence nor control. Finally, he stood, his exhaustion mingled with awe and something dangerous, jealousy, tempered by grudging respect. He had thought the court was the battlefield that demanded vigilance, but now he saw that the truest power lay in quiet preparation, in foresight, and in the courage to act before disaster came, lessons he could only observe, not claim. As he left the study, Shuyin's soft humming resumed, threading through the quiet halls of the manor, mixing with the faint scent of fresh silk and candle smoke. The court trembled, the city whispered, and the shadows of power shifted. But Liang Shuyin remained serene, untouchable, and fully alive, a Marchioness who had reclaimed her life and would not falter again. Chapter 14. The day began with a strange, restless hum in the air, as if the capital itself had sensed that something delicate was about to snap. Lady Yun, known for her calculated poise, entered the Marquis manor with none of her usual grace. Veiled and trembling, she swept past the servants as though the hall were hers, though the rustle of silk betrayed her anxiety. They scattered like startled birds, murmuring and curtsying, eyes wide with alarm. She made her way straight to the study, ignoring the customary knocking, the protocols, and even the presence of the household. Xian. Her voice, though quivering, carried authority, the kind that had sent many to their knees in the imperial court. You must help me. You know I'm innocent. You know I have done nothing wrong. Rong Xian froze mid-step. He was torn. One part of him wanted to maintain strict adherence to his own safety, to distance himself from scandal. Another part, an old loyalty he did not even realize lingered, stirred. His face was tight with indecision, his eyes darting to the sealed letters still fresh in his memory. Before he could find words to respond, a new presence entered the room, Liang Shuyin. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world, each footfall measured. The sway of her robe and the quiet strength in her posture gave her the unmistakable aura of someone who had already won. Lady Yun's eyes flicked to her, narrowing behind her veil. Innocent? Shuin's voice was soft, almost casual, but every syllable carried the weight of judgment. She stepped fully into the room, hands folded lightly in front of her, and let her gaze sweep over Lady Yun as though inspecting a rare, fragile artifact. Strange word for a woman whose letters are being copied in the capital's prison as we speak. Lady Yun's veil slipped slightly as her hand flew to her face, a flinch betraying the panic she tried to hide. You, she began, but no sound stronger than a gasp emerged, her composure faltering. Shuyin tilted her head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. Oh, please. You should have been more discreet. The maids gossip worse than courtiers. Her words fell lightly into the air but carried the sting of a whip. Xian's eyes widened. You leaked the letters? He asked, voice tight, disbelief sharpening every syllable. Shuyin met his gaze evenly, calm as a river in spring. You're welcome, she said softly. Not a hint of triumph, only a mild acknowledgement of the inevitable. The study held a sharp, bitter silence. Lady Yun's breathing quickened. She looked from Xian to Shuyin, as though measuring which would betray her first. It became quickly apparent that neither ally nor intimidation could be found in this room, only clarity and consequence. You, Lady Yun's voice shook. She tried to regain authority, to strike back, to manipulate the narrative. You Shuyin. Yu Shuin's eyes narrowed only slightly, the faintest curve of a smirk tugging at her lips. Call me what you will. You should have been careful. Letters are fragile things, easy to copy and even easier to misplace. The veiled lady's face paled to near translucence. Her usual charm, her carefully constructed web of influence, had failed her utterly. She realized, finally, that she had been outmaneuvered in a battle she did not even see coming. Rong Xian remained frozen, caught in the silent revelation of the woman before him. He had always believed his wife meek, pliable, perhaps even fragile. But here she was, a force he had failed to understand, wielding subtlety, intelligence, and foresight with lethal precision. The woman he had underestimated, dismissed, had orchestrated a coup that left the formidable Lady Yun exposed and crumbling. Shuin's voice, soft and deliberate, broke his reverie. Do you see, Marquis? Power is not always about rank or title. Sometimes, it is in knowing the truth and acting quietly, before the storm arrives. Lady Yun, realizing the futility of words and charm, stumbled backward. Her hands fumbled at the veil, twisting it as if it could protect her from shame or threat. This is not over, she hissed, though the conviction rang hollow. Shuyin let her move toward the door, her fingers tracing the edge of her silk sleeve with effortless composure. Perhaps not, she said mildly. But next time, do remember that even whispers travel faster than you think. And I have very good listeners. The princess fled the study with trembling steps, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive perfume and panic. The servants peered cautiously from the hallway, eyes wide as they watched the confrontation dissolve into silence. Even the air seemed sharper now, electric with the residue of confrontation, the scent of discipline, and the faint glow of candlelight reflecting off polished wood. Xian stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the space where his wife had stood. He could feel her presence linger, commanding, serene, untouchable. For the first time in years, he realized how little he had truly known her. All those mornings when she had silently attended to his needs, all those years of quiet compliance, had been only a fraction of who she really was. he muttered under his breath, but the words failed him. Shuyin turned slowly, letting her gaze meet his. There was no mockery in her eyes, only calm awareness, a quiet strength that made the room feel impossibly small and heavy all at once. She's made her choices, Shuyin said softly. And now, so have we. Xian exhaled slowly, realizing the truth in her words. He had spent years thinking of his wife as someone within his control, someone whose devotion he could measure, weigh, and assume. But in reality, Liang Shuyin had never been fully his, not in the ways that mattered. And now, she had claimed power in a way he could only admire, and perhaps fear. For a long moment, neither spoke. The candle burned low, shadows stretching across the study, and the quiet hum of the city beyond filtered through the windows. Outside, the world continued oblivious to the careful strategies, whispered words, and sudden reversals that had taken place in a quiet study of the Marquis manor. Finally, Shuyin stepped back fully, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Now, Marquis, perhaps we should attend to the household. It has been a long day, and it would be unfortunate if we lost sight of our duties while the court trembles. Xian nodded mutely, still absorbing the weight of what had occurred. He had expected drama, intrigue, perhaps even confrontation. But he had not anticipated clarity, precision, and execution delivered so calmly that it left him unarmed in the face of his own wife's brilliance. Shuyin swept past him, leaving the room in quiet order, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a mark of ownership over the calm she had restored. Xian remained, staring after her, realizing finally that his role in her world was no longer that of master, but witness. And for the first time, he understood that witnessing her might be the only thing he could do without disrupting the careful balance she had created. Outside, Lady Yun disappeared into the shadows, her pride shattered and her schemes laid bare. The court would soon hear of her misfortune, and the capital would murmur with gossip and speculation. But within the walls of the Marquis manor, Liang Shuyin stood unshaken, composed, and entirely untouchable, a woman who had long since learned that the sharpest victories required no anger, only patience, observation, and timing. And for Rong Xian, the lesson was one he could never forget. The wife he had once dismissed as meek was the one who had truly shaped the course of events, with a quiet fire that could not be ignored. Chapter 15. The court had barely caught its breath from Lady Yun's desperate flight when the ripples of her downfall began to spread like wildfire. Within days, her carefully cultivated network collapsed under scrutiny. The generals she had bribed, the minor officials who had served as conduits for her schemes, and even her closest confidants were stripped of their titles, humiliated publicly, or quietly dispatched from the capital under the emperor's strict orders. Whispers circulated through the palace corridors, repeating the same phrase in every voice: the princess's web has unraveled. Yet amidst the turmoil, the source of the exposure remained cloaked in mystery. The emperor himself sent a message of praise to the anonymous informant, commending the foresight and patriotism that had protected the integrity of the realm. This unseen hero had executed the coup with precision, but no one suspected that the Marchioness of Qinghe, Liang Shuyin, was the mind behind the revelation. She had moved quietly, orchestrating events, ensuring that each letter, each document, and each thread of evidence pointed unmistakably toward Lady Yun without ever implicating herself. Rong Xian received news of the court's reaction in stages. Each tidbit of gossip and each note from trusted aides sent a shiver of disbelief down his spine. His name had been perilously close to Lady Yun's in the rumor mill, yet his reputation remained intact. Relief should have flooded him, but instead, he felt hollow. For years, he had believed his life was carefully calculated, every move deliberate. Yet here he was, spared not by his own cunning but by the quiet force of the woman he had once dismissed as meek. Back at the Marquis manor, the household's mood was drastically different from the court's tension. The servants, who had grown accustomed to the subtle undercurrent of fear and obligation in the halls, now moved with cautious joy. Some whispered congratulations to one another, others allowed themselves the rare luxury of laughter without the pretense of propriety. Even the usually austere Madame Rong muttered prayers of thanks, convinced that divine mercy, not human intervention, had saved her family from scandal. She leaned heavily on the mantel, mumbling about gods and spirits as if each syllable might be a talisman against further misfortune. Shuyin, however, observed all of it with serene detachment. She wandered the halls, moving from room to room, letting the house breathe in the newfound ease. Her lips curved in a faint, almost enigmatic smile, her eyes unreadable. She had not acted out of vengeance or malice, not for herself, not for her husband, and certainly not for her mother-in-law's faint sense of gratitude. She had acted to close a door, to end a chapter, and to reclaim the balance she had long lost. Power, she understood, was most enduring when wielded quietly, without the need for applause. That evening, as the last of the day's light fell across the Marquis manor, she found her husband sitting alone in the study. A single candle flickered, throwing shadows across the polished desk, illuminating the untouched cup of tea before him. The room was quiet, save for the soft scratching of quills and the faint whisper of wind against the lattice windows. Xian's face was solemn, almost uncharacteristically reflective. He did not rise when she entered. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the dark liquid in the cup, as though the warmth of the tea could contain his unspoken thoughts. "You saved me," he said finally, voice low and cautious, as if the words themselves might shatter the fragile peace. Shuyin moved closer, her steps quiet against the wooden floor. She reached out, gently touching his shoulder, not in affection, but in acknowledgement of the moment. "No," she said softly, her voice calm and measured. "I saved myself. You just happened to benefit." Xian blinked, taken aback by the simplicity and honesty of her statement. He had expected gratitude, perhaps relief, or even some acknowledgement of the effort and cunning that had saved his name. Instead, she offered nothing but truth, and it was more piercing than any thanks could have been. Shuyin turned gracefully, leaving him with the tea that had been long forgotten and was now cooling rapidly. She allowed the door to close behind her with the faintest whisper, leaving the room steeped in the scent of fading candle wax, silk, and quiet contemplation. Xian remained seated, staring at the bitter liquid, realizing that it mirrored the unspoken bitterness of his own pride and misconceptions. He had survived the court's intrigue, yes, but only by riding on the strength of a woman he had never truly understood. Outside the study, Shuyin walked the halls of the manor, allowing herself a small stretch of satisfaction. There was no joy in vengeance, no pleasure in humiliating a rival. Her triumph was of a subtler nature, the reclamation of agency, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her future was firmly in her own hands. She paused briefly at the window overlooking the courtyard, where her son, Lin, played with a small embroidered hand puppet she had made for him that morning. His laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, filling the empty spaces of the manor with warmth. For the first time in years, Shuyin felt the world align around her. The scandal that had threatened to engulf her family had been contained, her household was safe, and her son's future bright, untainted, and free lay within her control. She allowed herself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile, savoring the calm she had crafted from chaos. Meanwhile, Xian remained in the study, wrestling with thoughts that had no easy resolution. He reflected on the months he had spent underestimating his wife, assuming that obedience equaled simplicity, that silence equaled weakness. How blind he had been. The woman who had once quietly tended to his household had orchestrated the unraveling of a princess's corruption with the elegance of a poet and the precision of a general. His admiration mingled uneasily with the realization that he had never truly known her and perhaps never could. By nightfall, the capital itself had quieted. Lady Yun's name was whispered only in fear and contempt, her faction dismantled, and the court cautiously tiptoed around the scandal, wary of implicating themselves further. In the Marquis manor, peace settled gently over the household. Shuyin returned to her embroidery, Suining quietly assisting her in cataloging designs and planning future work. The steady rhythm of silk and thread replaced the feverish tension that had gripped the city, each stitch a reminder of foresight and persistence. When Xian finally stood and poured himself another cup of tea, it was still bitter, and he drank it with awareness. The flavor was sharp, a reminder of lessons learned too late, of a quiet power that had operated entirely outside his influence. For the first time in years, he understood that some victories required no hand, only patience, observation, and courage, qualities he had underestimated in the woman who now ruled both her household and her own destiny. Shuyin, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, allowing herself the luxury of quiet reflection. She had faced death, betrayal, and misjudgment and emerged with her son, her home, and her agency intact. The Marchioness of Qinghe was no longer a title she bore lightly, it was a mantle she had earned through intellect, patience, and subtlety. And in that moment, she understood something crucial: freedom was sweeter than triumph, and safety was more precious than applause. Her eyes drifted toward the window again, catching the last light of dusk. Lin's laughter echoed faintly from the courtyard, mingling with the chirping of crickets. Shuyin allowed herself a single, small smile. The door of the past had closed, the webs of intrigue had been untangled, and her life finally was hers to command. And in that quiet, unassuming victory, she felt the weight of a lesson that could not be taught, only lived. Power was not always seen, influence was not always spoken, and sometimes, the strongest battles were won not with noise, but with silence, foresight, and unwavering calm. Chapter 16. The Marquis Manor had never been quieter. Even the usual hum of servants moving through the hallways, the gentle creak of floorboards under hurried steps, and the occasional clatter of dishes had softened, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and ink, mixed with the subtle sweetness of the chrysanthemums that Shuyin had arranged earlier that morning. It was the calm before an unseen storm, or perhaps, in this case, the calm after a battle she had already won. Shuyin entered the study with slow, deliberate steps, the hem of her light blue robe brushing the polished floor. In her hand, she held a single object, a sealed letter, its crimson ribbon tight and unbroken. The paper was fine, thick enough to carry weight, and its seal bore the emblem of the Marquis household. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary, but in its folds lay a decision that would change lives. Rong Xian, she said evenly, her voice steady, almost musical in its calmness. She placed the letter carefully on the desk before him. This is my request for separation. It's time. Xian, who had been reviewing ledgers and correspondence, froze mid-sentence. The inked characters on the papers before him seemed to blur as his gaze fixed on her. You're leaving me? His voice cracked, though he tried to mask it with the sharpness of disbelief. The words sounded absurd even to him, like some impossible statement delivered in the quiet of his own study. Shuyin's lips curved faintly, not with mockery, but with quiet certainty. I'm leaving the version of myself who needed your approval. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, sending a jolt of sound echoing through the room. Anger mingled with confusion, twisting his features. You'll throw away everything we've built? His voice was louder now, trembling with the tension between disbelief and frustration. Our home, our son, our everything. Shuyin's eyes, calm and composed, met his without a flicker of fear or hesitation. Her smile was faint, almost melancholy, but it carried a weight he could not ignore. You built walls, Marquis, she said softly, her tone smooth and unyielding. I'm choosing a door. For a moment, the study was suspended in silence. Xian's chest heaved with unspoken arguments, questions, and the urge to demand explanations. He wanted to shout, to beg, to convince her that life without him was unimaginable, that separation was impossible. But her gaze steady, unwavering, final held him in place. There was no pleading in her eyes, no wavering. Only clarity, and the quiet assertion of her choice. He tried another angle, faltering but desperate. And the court, the alliances, the name. You'll abandon all that? For what? For freedom? For whims? Shuyin shook her head gently. Not for whims. For the life I choose to live. For the self I've finally reclaimed. You taught me many things, Xian, but you never taught me to be free. This time, I choose it myself. He ran a hand through his hair, exasperation and hurt twisting his features. Do you not care for the house, for the manor? For your son? Shuyin knelt slightly to lift the small silver frame holding a portrait of their infant son. Linner's life will be full of laughter and choice. I intend to keep it that way. And I will be a mother who makes mistakes for him, learns with him, and grows beside him, not one who shrinks in silence to fit someone else's expectations. Xian's mouth opened, then closed. Words failed him. He could argue laws, alliances, proprieties, but not this. He could not argue against the quiet certainty of her presence in the room, the way she carried herself, the calm force of her mind and spirit that radiated from every gesture. Shuyin straightened and turned slowly toward the door. Her hand lingered for a moment on the knob, the letter still lying on the desk like a blade disguised in paper. I will not leave our son behind, she said softly, as though that were the only truth she needed to clarify. But I cannot remain the woman who sacrifices herself for a life that was never hers to begin with. Xian reached out instinctively, but his hand stopped short in midair. There was nothing to grab, no argument that could tether her. Every attempt to intervene was like reaching for smoke, beautiful, but untouchable. You're frightening, he admitted, the words escaping almost against his will. Calm, measured. You frighten me more than tears ever did. Shuyin's lips curved, a small, wry acknowledgement. Good, she said simply. Then perhaps you'll finally understand why I could never stay. The echo of her footsteps lingered long after the door closed behind her, leaving Xian staring at the letter, at the quiet emptiness of the study, and at the bitter taste of realization settling in his chest. He picked up the letter cautiously, as if it were fragile, as if its paper could cut him the moment he mishandled it. He traced the seal with his fingers, hesitant to break it, yet knowing that once opened, there would be no turning back. Meanwhile, Shuyin moved down the hall, pausing only briefly to peek into her son's room. Linner slept peacefully, his tiny hands clutching a soft toy, his lips curved in a slight, unconscious smile. Relief washed over her. This was her victory, not public, not loud, but private, and complete. She had reclaimed her life, her autonomy, and her son's future. By the time Xian returned to the study, the room felt impossibly large and empty. The tea he had left untouched that morning had cooled, the fragrance faded, leaving only the bitter residue of a cup abandoned in the shadow of his wife's decision. The bitter taste mirrored the lesson he was slowly forced to internalize, that life could not be controlled with rank, title, or expectation, that some battles were won not with force, but with quiet decisiveness and unflinching self-awareness. Shuyin's departure that day was more than the leaving of a marital home, it was a reclamation of her own existence. Every step she took, each measured movement, was a declaration that she would no longer exist in the shadow of anyone else's desires, judgments, or expectations. She would build, stitch, and weave a life of her own design, and in that life, she would be free. And as she stepped outside into the fading light of late afternoon, the wind carrying the scent of chrysanthemums and ink, she allowed herself a single, quiet smile. The door of the past was closed, the chapter written, and her life finally fully her own. Chapter 17. The house Shuyin rented in East Luoyang was small, but in its modesty lay a freedom she had never known in the Marquis manor. Sunlight poured through the tall latticed windows, casting lattices of gold across polished wooden floors. The faint scent of freshly dyed silk, mingling with beeswax and ink, drifted lazily through the air. It was a simple home, but for the first time in years, every sound, the laughter of her son, the brush of wind against the curtains, the gentle tap of needle on fabric, belonged entirely to her. Rong Lin toddled across the main room, his tiny fingers clutching scraps of vibrant fabric as though each piece were a treasure from a distant world. He pointed excitedly at the cranes embroidered on a new length of silk. "Mama, bird," he cried, his voice pure and unself-conscious. "Yes," Shuyin said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. She lifted the scrap for him to touch, letting him feel the smooth threads and tiny ridges of stitchwork. "They're flying away." Linner's eyes widened. "Fly far," he insisted, throwing the scrap toward the corner. His laughter echoed through the room, clear and unrestrained, and Shuyin felt a weight lift from her chest. This was the sound of freedom, the laughter of a household untethered from fear and obligation. In the afternoons, Su Yining came by, always bringing a small bundle of papers tied neatly with ribbon. He had become a fixture of the house, but never an intruder. He helped her handle trade permits, scouted rare silks from trusted merchants, and delivered his latest poems, written with her designs in mind. There was no pretense between them, no expectation beyond shared work. Their conversations were filled with gentle teasing, quiet observation, and laughter that came naturally, not as a performance for the court or the gossiping nobility. "You know," Su Yining said one morning, watching Linner attempt to wrap himself in a length of silk, "this child may be the most industrious apprentice I've ever seen. Or the most destructive." Shuyin chuckled, guiding her son away from a pile of delicate threads. "Let him be. Mistakes are a child's way of learning. And besides, destruction is only creation in disguise." He raised an eyebrow. "Wise words, Marchioness. I hope you'll let him teach me someday." "I think he already has," she replied lightly, her eyes catching the sunlight that glimmered off the silk. Her business, Mist of Liang River, began quietly but quickly gained notice. Noble women whispered to one another, admiring the elegance of her designs without realizing who had crafted them. Plums blossomed on frost-laden fabric, cranes soared across hidden skies, and each pattern bore subtle messages of autonomy and defiance. Silk for silk, she stitched not just beauty but the reclaiming of her life. Occasionally, delivery boys arrived with letters or notes from buyers, expressing admiration for the artistry. Shuyin read each one with the same meticulous care she applied to her work. Every order was a silent acknowledgement of her success, a reassurance that she had built something enduring with her own hands. She never sought fame. Anonymity was part of the thrill, but the knowledge that her creations moved people in ways that transcended her own expectations gave her a quiet satisfaction. Evenings were her own. After the workshop quieted and the last candle was extinguished, she often lingered by the window, watching Linner asleep in his small bed. The soft rise and fall of his chest, the peaceful curl of his fingers around a small stuffed crane, reminded her of everything she had fought for: life, freedom, and the power to choose. Sometimes, she allowed herself to think of the past, of the life in the Marquis manor, of the cold walls, and the unspoken rules that had kept her from speaking, from moving, from truly living. But the memories no longer weighed on her like chains. They were just shadows, reminders of why she had fought to claim her space, her time, and her autonomy. Su Yining would often linger in the background during these quiet moments, working on a poem or sketching beside her, but never intruding. There was a gentle rhythm to their companionship, a dance of trust and respect. Sometimes he would glance up and smile at her, a faint teasing in his eyes. "You look too peaceful," he would say. "I worry you might forget how to be dangerous." Shuyin would laugh softly, shaking her head. "Dangerous is overrated. Comfort and control are far more satisfying." Linner would occasionally crawl over, tugging at the edge of her robe, asking for a story or a song. Shuyin would oblige, spinning small tales about cranes and phoenixes, birds that could speak if you listened carefully enough. The boys' laughter would ripple through the sunlit house, weaving a soundscape of joy that made even the wind outside seem lighter. The house was not grand. It had no gilded halls or marble floors. There were no imposing walls to impress courtiers, no ceremonial gates to guard. But within its modest space, she had something far more precious: autonomy, laughter, and the freedom to fail, succeed, and live on her own terms. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the lanterns outside glimmered like fireflies, Shuyin sat cross-legged on a floor cushion, embroidery frame balanced on her lap. Linner had fallen asleep on a pillow beside her, a small hand resting on a length of patterned silk. Su Yining had departed hours ago, leaving behind a poem inspired by her newest design, a crane soaring above a misty river. She paused, threading the needle carefully, and realized how much she breathed differently now. No fear pressed on her chest, no worry gnawed at the edges of her day. The air was hers, the hours hers, and even the mistakes, the missteps, the miscalculations belonged to her alone. Mist of Liang River was more than just a business. It was a declaration, a canvas of independence stitched into silk. And as she worked through the quiet night, she understood that she was building something that could not be taken from her, a life of her own design, where laughter, love, and freedom were not privileges, but birthrights. Outside, the moon rose high over East Luoyang, silver light spilling across rooftops and streets. Inside, Shuyin paused, gently pressing a fingertip to the sleeping Linner's hand. Her lips curved into a small, serene smile. For the first time, truly, she breathed without remembering what it was to hurt. And in the simple rhythm of needle, silk, and quiet companionship, Liang Shuyin discovered a joy far richer than the power or position she had once been offered. The house had no chains. And neither did she. Chapter 18. The Marquis manor had changed in ways that no marble pillar or gilded railing could mask. The hallways, once alive with the quiet rhythm of her footsteps and the soft rustle of silk, now seemed like corridors of echoing emptiness. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a ghostly trace that teased the senses and sharpened the ache of absence. Even the roses that had bloomed in careful arrangements along the windowsills seemed duller, their petals lacking the energy her presence had lent them. Rong Xian moved through the rooms as though wandering through a mausoleum disguised as a home. His hands, so used to giving commands and directing affairs, now trembled slightly as he touched the back of her chair at the dining table. He could almost hear her calm, slightly teasing voice, the faint lilt of laughter as she reminded him not to drink tea too quickly or scold the maids for minor missteps. He sank into the chair, staring at the empty space across from him. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine she was there, poised and serene, one hand delicately cradling a teacup, the other resting on her embroidery frame. It was an illusion that offered no comfort, only the cruel reminder of what he had lost. The stack of letters he had written in the weeks since her departure sat neatly on the desk. Dozens of them, each folded and sealed with painstaking care. Some were apologies, others explanations, a few edged with half-meant promises and desperate pleas. He had delivered them personally to merchants, scribes, and even the occasional messenger, hoping she would somehow receive them. None had ever reached her. "They won't read themselves," he muttered one evening, staring at the pile. Yet he knew, in some corner of his heart, that it wasn't the letters themselves that mattered, but the absence of her choice to accept them. She had moved forward. He had been left behind. His daily routines became hollow repetitions. He wandered the gardens she had tended, noting how the roses drooped under their own weight, untended now, and how the small patch of herbs she had liked to prune with gentle fingers had grown wild and unmanageable. He reached for them instinctively, but stopped, realizing that no act of care could replace her. Even the old tea set she had loved sat on the shelf, waiting as it always had. Xian's fingers brushed the rim of her favorite cup one morning, and he whispered under his breath, "You were right. I never noticed until it was too late." The porcelain was cool beneath his touch, indifferent to his regret. Servants moved quietly through the house, eyes lowered, whispering in hushed tones that their lord had aged years in a single month. They watched as he refused invitations to court gatherings, turned down banquets, and dismissed emissaries with curt gestures. When Lady Yan's name surfaced, spoken casually by nobles in the halls, he did not engage. He simply walked away, the shadow of her betrayal, and his own, folding around him like a cloak. The halls, once vibrant with carefully orchestrated etiquette and subtle power plays, now felt impossibly vast. Each empty room echoed with memory, each unlit corner whispered her absence. Xian realized, perhaps too late, that he had spent years focused on appearances, ambition, and political victories, yet failed to win the one battle that mattered: the warmth, the life, and the quiet love that Shuyin had brought into his home. He tried to occupy his mind with work, with reports from the provincial governors, and with the endless correspondence that marked the life of a man of rank. But the more he engaged with politics, the more the absence pressed in on him. Decisions that once came easily now seemed hollow. Every move in court, every political negotiation, carried a subtle echo of her laughter, of the sharpness in her eyes, of her quiet independence. He remembered her hands, delicate and precise, threading silk through fabric, shaping birds and blossoms with elegance. He remembered the calm certainty in her voice when she had told him that she was choosing a door, not wandering aimlessly, and how that moment had made him feel simultaneously proud and powerless. He had survived battles, led men into war, navigated the treacherous waters of court intrigue, but he could not fight the silence she had left behind. It was more formidable than any enemy he had faced. Sleep eluded him most nights. The dark hours were filled with imagined conversations, echoes of laughter, and the quiet murmur of her voice reminding him of all the small things he had ignored: the way she hummed while tending to her son, the subtle elegance with which she moved through the halls, the resilience in her hands and mind that had always gone unnoticed. The emptiness of the manor was not just in its rooms, it had seeped into his bones. Even the servants noticed changes in him that he could not disguise. The orderly lines of his hair were slightly askew, his sharp suit slightly wrinkled, and the carefully calculated calm that had once marked every gesture now faltered. He no longer carried himself with the meticulous control of a man who expected everything to bend to his will. Instead, he moved like someone haunted by what had slipped past his grasp, by the presence that had once illuminated his life and now left only shadows. One evening, standing alone on the balcony overlooking the empty gardens, Xian let the wind catch his hair and the chill brush against his cheeks. He thought of Shuyin's workshop, of her laughter, of the small sunlit house where she now tended to her son and her craft. He imagined her speaking to Su Yining with that calm authority, guiding him through subtle details, smiling when he teased her. The image burned like fire behind his eyes, beautiful, untouchable, and utterly beyond his reach. He realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, that she had won not because she had bested him, but because she had refused to depend on him. Every choice he had tried to control: the household, the court, the small spheres of influence mattered less than the simple fact that she had claimed her own life. She had taken the one thing he could never take: agency. And so, Xian wandered through the empty halls, paused at the dining table, and traced the outline of her chair again. He poured a cup of tea, bitter and dark, and let it cool in silence, the aroma a pale reminder of what he had lost. His reflection in the polished wood of the table stared back at him, sharp-featured, orderly, but incomplete. The house was intact, the walls unbroken, and yet the life that had animated it was gone. Outside, the city continued, oblivious to his quiet devastation. Merchants shouted from the streets, children played in the lanes, and the sun dipped behind tiled roofs. Life moved on, but Xian remained suspended in the stillness of a house without a wife, a child he could not fully claim, and the echoes of a woman who had taught him more than he would ever learn from triumph or title. He had survived wars, political machinations, and the most treacherous of alliances. But he had not survived himself, had not survived the quiet, unavoidable lesson that some losses could not be conquered. The Marquis manor was grand, but it was hollow, its gilded walls only served to amplify the absence that now defined his existence. And in that emptiness, Rong Xian understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had been defeated not by any rival, enemy, or court intrigue but by the silence of the one woman whose presence had once made all else worth enduring. He would lead armies, host councils, and navigate the politics of the capital. But no victory would ever match the quiet, unassailable power of the woman who had walked away and taken with her the warmth and laughter that had once been his home. The Marquis without a wife had nothing left but memory, regret, and the long, echoing corridors of a house that had learned what it meant to be empty. Chapter 19. The city of Liang shimmered under spring sunlight, the kind that made rooftops glimmer and rivers glitter as if the world had been washed clean. Shuyin adjusted the sash of her light green robe and felt the first real sense of ease she had experienced in years. The air smelled of peach blossoms, fresh bread from the nearby vendors, and the faint tang of river water. Everywhere she looked, there was movement, children darting past, street performers balancing on stilts, merchants calling over their goods. For once, she felt part of this world, not trapped within it. Rong Lin's small hand tugged at her sleeve as he tried to keep pace with a street urchin chasing a paper lantern. "Mama, bird," he shouted, pointing at a lantern shaped like a crane floating in the wind. "Yes, little one," Shuyin replied, her voice light, letting herself laugh at his excitement. She lifted him slightly so he could see over the crowd. "See how it flies? Just like the cranes in your embroidery." A gentle chuckle drifted from the bridge behind her, and she turned to see Su Yining waiting with a scroll in his hand. His hair caught the sunlight, glinting dark gold, and his usual crooked grin softened at the sight of her. "I have something for you," he said, holding the scroll forward. "A new poem. Inspired by a woman who taught me what freedom looks like." Shuyin arched a brow, half skeptical, half amused. "You flatter too easily, Su Yining." "Then you haven't read it yet," he said, his grin widening. He unfurled the scroll, letting the wind tease the edges. "Let me recite it for you." He spoke softly at first, letting the rhythm of the words match the flow of the river beneath them. The poem wove images of birds soaring above misty waters, of rivers breaking through ice to meet the sun, and of a woman walking alone with a child, her laughter brighter than the spring light. Each line felt familiar yet new, as though it had been waiting for her to notice it. Rong Lin, however, had other priorities. He tugged at Shuyin's sleeve again, giggling uncontrollably at a duck waddling into the river from the bridge. The sound was infectious, blending with the call of the birds and the murmur of the water. Shuyin felt it tickle her heart, pulling a smile she hadn't realized she'd been holding back for so long. It wasn't polite, it wasn't performative, it was just hers. Su Yining paused midline, noticing the transformation. The sharp, composed Marchioness of Qinghe had dissolved into something lighter, freer, and real. He watched her bend slightly to adjust her son's little hat, the strands of her hair catching the sun as she laughed. She was not merely a figure to be admired from afar, she was alive, radiant in her agency, in her laughter, in the life she had reclaimed. Shuyin looked up at him, letting the corners of her lips curl without restraint. "You make it sound as though I did all this just to inspire poetry," she said teasingly, but her eyes betrayed amusement and warmth. "Perhaps not for poetry alone," Su Yining admitted, bowing his head with a grin. "But it is difficult to ignore beauty that lives so freely. You carry it with you everywhere, even when you try to walk quietly." Rong Lin, not one for subtlety, squealed as a small fish leapt from the river, splashing water onto the wooden planks of the bridge. Shuyin scooped him up in one arm, brushing droplets from his hair, and laughed herself. The sound felt like music, a melody that had been missing from the house, the manor, the city itself. They strolled slowly along the bridge, letting the river wind tease at their sleeves and the lanterns float lazily in the sky above. For the first time, Shuyin realized she was not rushing. There was no pressure to be admired, no expectation to appease, no burden of surviving some invisible trap of etiquette or politics. She simply walked, watched, and breathed. Su Yining followed beside her, occasionally pointing out subtle details, a pattern in the brickwork, the way sunlight caught a ripple in the water, a bird's flight that mirrored the arcs of her embroidery cranes. She listened, nodding, laughing, and occasionally teasing him about the florid metaphors he always seemed to find in the simplest things. By mid-afternoon, the bridge was crowded with children chasing each other and merchants selling sweetmeats. Shuyin let Linner toddle ahead for a moment, his tiny legs pumping furiously, his laughter loud enough to draw smiles from strangers. She felt a pang of tenderness, realizing that the world could still be a place of wonder for him and for her. They stopped at a small bench overlooking the river. Su Yining unrolled his scroll again, showing her the carefully inked words that had been inspired by her embroidery designs and the freedom she had claimed. She traced the calligraphy lightly with a fingertip, smiling faintly at the way the words captured a life she had fought so hard to reclaim. "You've made it sound effortless," she said softly, leaning back against the bench. "But freedom is hardly a single act. It's 1,000 small decisions, each one a tiny rebellion." Su Yining nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And yet you wear it like the finest silk, so light that it appears natural." Shuin's lips curved in a quiet smile. "Natural, perhaps. But learned, always. I wouldn't trade the lessons for anything, though even the bitter ones." The sun dipped lower in the sky, turning the river gold and the lanterns into floating stars. Linner sat beside her, clutching a paper crane Su Yining had made him, and she pressed a kiss to his hair. There was no need for grandeur, no need for spectacle. The small, sunlit bridge, the river, the paper lanterns, and the warmth of her son's laughter were enough. She looked across at Su Yining, meeting his gaze squarely. "Peace," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I don't need romance. I don't need courtly triumphs. Peace is enough." He smiled, bowing slightly, though his eyes held admiration and a hint of mischief. "Then you have it, Marchioness. And you've earned it more than anyone I've ever known." She let the words settle around her like spring sunlight warming chilled skin. For the first time, she felt the absence of the past and the presence of herself coexist without conflict. Rong Lin tugged at her sleeve again, and she laughed freely, letting the day, the river, and the soft pink blossoms fill her entirely. It was not the ending of a tale filled with intrigue, betrayal, or ambition. It was a beginning, a life woven with care, laughter, and the deliberate, gentle defiance of a woman who had learned to choose herself. The bridge, the river, the paper cranes, and the laughter of her child formed the world she had claimed. And in that world, she was at last home. Chapter 20. The city of Luoyang had begun to settle into the slower rhythm of late spring. Petals from peach and cherry blossoms drifted across the streets like pale snow, caught in the occasional gust of wind that carried the chatter of merchants and the laughter of children. Shuyin had long stopped counting the seasons in terms of palace intrigues, court gossip, or her own narrowly avoided demise. Instead, she measured time by her son's first steps, the first hesitant strokes of ink on her embroidery sketches, and the quiet mornings when sunlight spilled through the curtains of their modest home. News of the Marquis of Qinghe reached her unexpectedly. A merchant delivering silk to her workshop leaned in, lowering his voice with exaggerated caution. "Mist of Liang River. I beg your pardon, madam, but I thought you might wish to know the Marquis has resigned from the capital. Illness, they say. Some claim he's gone to the mountains, others whisper of the southern coast. A wandering soul, perhaps, seeking peace." Shuyin tilted her head, listening quietly. Her lips didn't curve, her face remained calm, betraying nothing. It was a sensation she had learned well over the past months, a strange, light detachment. The weight of what had been lost no longer crushed her chest, it simply rested, acknowledged, and contained. She nodded politely, thanked the merchant, and watched him depart, leaving her in a silence that was oddly comforting. Later, she found her son sprawled across the floor of their sunlit workshop, a pile of colorful spools arranged haphazardly before him. He was building towers, carefully stacking the cylindrical shapes atop one another. "Mama, look," he exclaimed. "I made the tallest tower." Shuyin crouched beside him, observing the precarious spools. "Careful," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "They fall if you stack them too high." Rong Lin's wide eyes shone with the determination only a child could muster. "Then we build again," he said, giggling as the tower wobbled and toppled dramatically. He clapped his hands, unbothered by the collapse, already reaching for another spool. Shuyin laughed, the sound light and unburdened, echoing in the small room where sunlight pooled in golden patches on the wooden floor. She scooped him up into her arms, spinning him gently so that his laughter multiplied, filling every corner of their home. Again, she whispered, brushing her cheek against his soft hair. And again. "We'll build as many towers as we like." The sun had shifted by the time they settled back onto the floor, the room now bathed in warm, forgiving light. Shuyin glanced out the window, letting her gaze linger on the quiet street. No courtiers, no whispered plots, no grand expectations, only the hum of ordinary life, vibrant in its own subtle ways. This was home now. Not the Marquis manner, not the titles, not the careful diplomacy she had once relied upon. Home was laughter that didn't need to be concealed, the warmth of her son pressed against her, the freedom to choose her own days. Her mind drifted briefly to Su Yining, whose quiet support had become a constant in their lives. He had helped with trade permits, offered gentle advice on designs, and filled her workshop with words that complemented the silk and thread she cherished. They had grown comfortable in a companionship built not on expectation, but on shared respect and subtle amusement. Today, he would likely be visiting with a new poem in hand, eager to see her smile again. The thought made her chest lift slightly, light as spring air. Shuyin stood, carrying her son to the windowsill to watch the lanterns being strung for a local festival. Linner pressed his tiny hands against the glass, pointing to a group of children chasing a dog along the street. "Mama, chase," he shouted, his eyes bright with anticipation. She smiled, setting him down so that he could run, laughing as he joined the impromptu game. The world outside was alive, unthreatening, filled with small adventures and innocent joy. The sunlight poured over the wooden floor, bouncing off her embroidery, highlighting the cranes and plum blossoms she had painstakingly stitched over countless hours. Shuyin sat back, letting herself breathe fully for the first time in years. She remembered the weight of the Marquis manor, the constant need to appease, to anticipate, to survive. She remembered the fear, the calculated smiles, the whispered poisonings, the quiet despair that had once seemed inescapable. And now, here she was, threading silk, hearing her son's laughter, choosing each day without fear. The contrast was dizzying, but it was hers, fully hers. Her gaze shifted to the paper cranes she had suspended from the ceiling. They twirled gently in the breeze, casting tiny shadows across the walls. "We made these fly," she whispered to herself, a soft smile curling her lips. It wasn't boastful. It wasn't prideful. It was acknowledgement of freedom, of survival, of small victories stitched into every fiber of her being. Lin returned, breathless but radiant, holding a newly built tower of spools precariously balanced. "Look, Mama. I made it taller than before." Shuyin took his hands in hers, steadying the structure. "Yes," she said, her voice warm. "And it will stand as long as you wish it to." She kissed his forehead, feeling the gentle pulse of life that reminded her why every choice she had made was necessary. To protect him, to protect herself, to claim a life worth living. As the day waned, Su Yining appeared at the doorway, scroll in hand, bowing slightly with the familiar crooked smile. "I brought a new poem," he said, voice low so that only she could hear. "It speaks of cranes that never stop flying, even when storms pass over their heads." Shuyin accepted the scroll with a small nod, unrolling it and reading aloud, her son perched at her side. The words spoke not just of freedom, but of resilience, of quiet defiance, of beauty and persistence. She read the final line and looked up at Su Yining, a smile finally reaching her eyes. "Peace," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "I don't need titles, I don't need approval, I don't need applause. I need this. This is enough." He inclined his head, understanding perfectly. "Then you have it, Marchioness." "Truly." Outside, the sunlight shifted to gold, spilling across the spools and silk, the cranes and the laughter, the small household that had become her world. She swept a hand through her son's hair, drawing him close, and whispered, "Let's go home." Home was no longer a manor, no longer a title, no longer a life dictated by others. Home was this, a small workshop filled with light and warmth, the laughter of a child, the freedom to build, to create, to simply be. And this time, she didn't look back. Not at the empty corridors of a grand house. Not at the letters that had gone unanswered. Not at the husband who had once taken her presence for granted. She had survived, she had learned, and now, she had chosen. The sun dipped lower, painting the room in soft hues of amber and rose. Lin, eyes bright, handed her a spool, giggling. "Mama, build with me?" Shuyin took it, smiling fully, and together they began another tower, hands working side by side, laughter mingling with sunlight and the quiet hum of life. Outside, the city moved, but for once, it did not matter. She was here, alive, and free. And for the first time, Liang Shuyin knew that she had rewritten her life entirely not in grand gestures or dramatic triumphs, but in the small, enduring joys that had once seemed impossible. A life stitched carefully, lovingly, and entirely her own.
If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more tales from Sparrow's Realm. Until next time, keep listening, and let your imagination soar.